She knew exactly who he was the moment he walked through her door. The man standing in her lobby wasn't a stranger. He was the man who had once loved her sister, the man her sister had destroyed with lies and silence, the man who had spent years believing he was the villain of a story he never got to finish. And somewhere in the drawer behind her, sealed and unread, were the letters that could have saved him years of pain. She handed him a room key. She smiled like nothing was wrong. Hit like and drop your city in the comments. Let me see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because nothing about this week is going to go the way either of them planned. The storm came in from the northwest sometime around 3 in the afternoon, the kind that didn't announce itself with dramatic clouds or dropping temperatures. It just arrived, gray and certain and indifferent, the way bad weather always did along that particular stretch of coastline, as though the sea had grown tired of pretending it would behave. Claire Bennett was on her knees behind the front desk when she heard the car. She was trying to fix a heating pipe that had been leaking since October, a job she'd been putting off for 3 weeks because the plumber had quoted her $1,400, and she had, at that exact moment in her checking account, $412 and some change. She had a wrench in her hand, a smear of rust along her left forearm, and a strip of duct tape between her teeth. The duct tape was not going to fix the pipe. She knew that. But it was Tuesday, and sometimes you just needed to hold something together until Thursday. The sound of tires on gravel made her sit up too fast and knock her head on the underside of the desk. "Perfect," she said, to no one. She got to her feet, pulled the duct tape out of her mouth, and looked through the rain-streaked front window. A car had pulled into the lot, black, expensive, the kind of car that looked like it had been designed specifically to make other cars feel bad about themselves. It sat there for a moment, engine running, wipers going, and then the door opened. The man who got out wasn't dressed for a coastal storm. Dark coat, good shoes, no umbrella. He stood in the rain for a second looking up at the sign above the inn. Bennett's, it read, in letters that had once been gold and were now more of a tired yellow. And something about the way he stood there made Claire's chest tighten in a way she couldn't immediately explain. Then he turned his face toward the window, and she saw who he was. She had to grab the edge of the desk. Ethan Holloway. 32 years old, CEO of Holloway Capital Group, which owned somewhere between 12 and 15% of the commercial real estate on the eastern seaboard, depending on which financial magazine you read. Twice named to Forbes's 40 Under 40. Once married to her sister, Diana Bennett, in a ceremony Claire had not been invited to because she and Diana had not spoken in 3 years at that point, which was its own story. The kind of story that didn't have a clean beginning or a clean ending, just a long middle full of small betrayals and unread text messages. She knew his face from news articles, from photographs Diana had sent in the early years, back when Diana still wanted people to know she had married someone important. She knew the line of his jaw and the way his hair went slightly dark when it was wet. She did not know what he was doing standing in the parking lot of her struggling inn on a Tuesday afternoon in November. He pushed through the front door. The bell above it rang once, soft and tired, the way it always did. "Hey," he said, and shook the rain off his coat. He looked around the lobby, the faded armchairs, the fireplace with its actual working fire, the wooden floors that creaked in 3 specific spots, the framed photographs of the harbor that her mother had hung 20 years ago and Claire had never taken down. Do you have rooms available?" His voice was lower than she'd expected, tired in a way that didn't have anything to do with the drive. "We do," Claire said. Her own voice came out steady. She was slightly impressed with herself. "How many nights?" He hesitated. "I'm not sure yet. Is that a problem?" "No." She reached under the desk for the actual guest ledger because the digital system had crashed 2 months ago and she hadn't had the money to fix it. "We're not exactly at capacity this time of year." That was a kind way of saying she was the only person there. Had been the only person there for 11 days. He stepped up to the desk, and she kept her eyes on the ledger, on the pen in her hand, on the blank line where she needed to write his name. "Name?" she asked. "Ethan Holloway." She wrote it down. Her handwriting didn't shake. She was very proud of her handwriting not shaking. "Address?" He gave her a Manhattan address. Of course he did. "And what brings you out this way, Mr. Holloway?" It was a standard question. She asked every guest. He looked at her for a moment like he was deciding how much of the truth was worth telling a stranger. "Needed to get somewhere quiet," he said finally. You picked a good week for it, Claire said. Storm's supposed to sit on us until at least Thursday. Something moved across his face. Not quite relief. Maybe the closest thing to it he'd let himself feel in a while. That's fine, he said. That's actually fine. She gave him room 4, which was the best room. It faced the water, had the working radiator, and had a bathroom where the hot water pressure was actually good. It was also the most expensive room, which at this inn meant it cost $95 a night, a price that was probably an insult to a man who owned a percentage of the eastern seaboard, but was the most Claire felt she could charge with a straight face, given the state of the ceiling in the hallway. She watched him carry his own bag up the stairs. Then she sat down in the chair behind the desk, put her face in her hands, and stayed like that for about 45 seconds. Pushk. Diana had not been a bad person. Exactly. That was what made it complicated. She had been selfish in the particular way that very beautiful people sometimes were. Not cruel, just careless, the way someone is careless with things they assume will always be available to them. She had taken what she wanted and left behind what didn't suit her, and she had never once, in Claire's memory, seemed to understand why that might eventually cost her something. She had met Ethan Holloway at a charity gala 7 years ago. Claire had been 23, working double shifts at a restaurant in Portland, sending what money she could back to their mother who was running this inn alone and getting tired. Diana had been 26 and beautiful and standing in a room full of wealthy men looking for something worth keeping. She had called Claire 2 weeks later to say she'd met someone extraordinary. He's serious, Diana had said on the phone, in a tone that meant serious money. Like, actually serious? That's great, Di. He has a daughter, from a previous relationship. Little girl, 3 years old. Okay. I told him I love kids. A pause. I'm going to love kids, right? Like, I can figure that out? That was the moment Claire should have said something. Should have asked the harder question. But Diana was her sister, and Claire was 23 and tired, and she just said, "Sure, yeah, you'll figure it out," and went back to her shift. They got married 14 months later. Claire wasn't invited. That was the year she and Diana had stopped speaking over something that had started as an argument about their mother's medical bills and turned into every unspoken thing between them all at once. By the time the wedding happened, Claire had accepted that her sister lived in a different world now, one that didn't have a place for her in it. She knew the marriage had ended. She'd read about it in a small business journal that was covering Ethan's company, a single line in a profile piece, something about a recent divorce and his focus returning to work. She hadn't known the details. She hadn't tried to find out. What she had found out 2 years ago came by accident. She'd been cleaning out a storage closet. Her mother had died the previous spring, leaving Claire the inn and a quiet, enormous debt. And in a box of her mother's things, she found a bundle of envelopes. 7 of them, bundled with a rubber band, all addressed to Diana at their mother's address, all unopened, all in the same handwriting, all from Ethan Holloway. She hadn't opened them either, hadn't thrown them away. Had put them in the drawer of the front desk because she didn't know what else to do with them, and she'd been telling herself for 2 years that she'd figure it out eventually. She had not, in fact, figured it out. He came down for dinner at 7. The inn had a small dining room off the lobby, 6 tables, which was 4 more than she needed on most nights. She had leftover soup from the afternoon, bread she'd made that morning because baking was one of those things that helped her think, and a bottle of wine she'd been keeping back for a reason she'd never identified. She was setting a single place at the table nearest the fire when she heard him on the stairs. "You cook?" he said, stopping in the doorway. "Enough to keep guests from leaving bad reviews," Claire said. "Sit wherever. It's just soup tonight. Storm knocked out the delivery I was expecting." He sat at the table she'd set, which somehow felt like a small decision with weight to it. He changed out of the rain-soaked coat into a dark sweater, and he looked, she searched for the word, smaller than he had in the lobby. Not in a bad way, just less armored. "Smells good," he said. "It's white bean and kale. My mother's recipe." She brought the bowl over, set it down, went back for the bread. "Wine?" "Please." She poured 2 glasses without thinking about it and then stood there for a second holding her own, not sure if she should sit or go back to the kitchen. "You don't have to hover," he said. Not unkindly. "If you were going to eat anyway." "I was," she said, which was true. She sat down at the next table over, which felt like the right amount of distance, close enough to be polite, far enough to make clear she wasn't crowding him. They ate in silence for a while. The fire popped. Rain hit the windows in irregular bursts. Outside, the harbor was invisible behind the dark and the weather, but you could hear it, the low repeated sound of water moving against the dock. "This place is yours?" he asked. "My mother's. Was my mother's." Claire tore a piece of bread. "She left it to me when she passed, along with the mortgage and the joy of negotiating with an insurance company that doesn't want to pay for a new roof." "How long ago?" 18 months, give or take." He nodded slowly, turning his wine glass. "I'm sorry. Thank you." She waited a beat. "You have a daughter, right?" The question came out before she decided to ask it, which was a problem because she only knew the answer because of Diana, and Diana was a door she absolutely could not open. He looked up. "Yeah, Sophie. She's 6. Something in his face shifted, the way faces do when people mention someone they love and miss in the same breath. She's with family this week. He stopped, tried again. "I needed a few days." "I get that," Claire said, and meant it. He looked at her for a moment, like he was trying to figure out if she was being polite or honest, and apparently decided on honest because he relaxed slightly. "This probably sounds ridiculous," he said, "but I drove past this place 3 times before I stopped." "Why'd you stop the 4th time?" "The light," he said, and nodded at the window. "You had a light on in the front window. Everything else along this road was dark and shut up for the season, and you had a light on." She thought about the lamp she kept burning in the front window. She kept it on because her mother had always kept it on, had said once that a dark inn looked like a dead inn, and a dead inn turned people away. She'd kept that lamp on every night for 18 months without thinking much about it. "Glad it worked," she said. "Me too," he said quietly, looking back at his soup. "Me too." The storm got worse overnight. By morning, it was the kind of weather that rewrote your plans. The road that connected the inn to the main coastal highway had water running across it in 2 places. The weather report on Claire's phone showed the system stalling out, possibly through Friday, maybe into the weekend. She found him in the dining room at 7:30, standing at the window with a coffee cup, watching the water. "Road's bad," she said. "I know. I tried to check it this morning." He turned around. He had circles under his eyes, the kind that suggested he'd slept but not well. "I'm not in a hurry, if that's okay." "It's okay," she said. "I'll put breakfast together." She made eggs and toast and didn't make a big thing of it. He ate and she refilled his coffee twice, and they didn't talk much, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that settles in when 2 people have agreed, without saying so, that they're not going to perform anything for each other today. Around 10, he appeared in the doorway of the back hallway where she was trying to address the pipe situation again. "What's broken?" he asked. "This pipe." She sat back on her heels. "It's been leaking since October. She looked at the duct tape in her hand and decided not to finish that sentence. "Do you have a pipe wrench?" She looked at him. "Are you offering to help or asking an inventory question?" "Offering," he said. "I'm not doing anything else." She handed him the wrench. He was not, it turned out, a man who was precious about getting his hands dirty. He lay on the floor of the back hallway in his good sweater and worked on that pipe for an hour and a half, asking her to hand him things, muttering at the corrosion, getting a grease mark on his forearm that he wiped on his sleeve without appearing to notice or care. "You own a construction company or something?" she asked, watching him. "Real estate development, some construction." He grunted at a reluctant fitting. "I spent summers on job sites when I was in college. My uncle was a contractor. I liked it." He paused. "I don't do enough of it anymore." "You do enough of sitting in boardrooms, though, I'm guessing." He laughed, a short, genuine sound that seemed to surprise him slightly. "Yeah, more than enough." The pipe stopped leaking at 11:43. She knew the exact time because she checked her phone and she wrote it down in the maintenance log she kept because her mother had kept one, and it seemed like the right thing to continue. November 14th, 11:43 a.m., hallway pipe, fixed by guest. She stared at those words for a second and then wrote E. Holloway next to them, very small. The middle days of that week settled into a rhythm neither of them planned. He helped where he saw things needed doing. Not because she asked, but because he was apparently a person who couldn't see something broken and walk past it. He was methodical about it. The way people are when they grew up around work, and the habit is deeper than thought. He fixed the latch on the storm shutters. He replaced a fuse in the kitchen that had been making the lights flicker. He found a problem with the front door hinge that Claire had been compensating for so long she'd stopped noticing it. She cooked. She always cooked. It was the one part of running the inn that didn't feel like survival. In the evenings, they ate together without formally deciding to, and they talked. Not about anything important, at first. Weather, mostly. The town. He asked questions about the harbor, where the boats went in the off-season, who owned which dock, why the lighthouse at the point had been decommissioned. She found herself telling him things she hadn't thought about in years, stories her mother had told her, bits of local history she'd absorbed without meaning to. He was, she discovered, a genuinely good listener, not the kind that waits for their turn, the kind that actually tracks the thread of what you're saying and asks the question that belongs to it. On Wednesday evening, she made pasta with a sauce that needed 3 hours on the stove, and he sat at the kitchen table and kept her company while she worked. The radio was on. Rain on the roof, the smell of onions and herbs, and the faint brine of the harbor coming through the slightly imperfect seal around the kitchen window. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Sure," she said, not turning from the stove. "How do you actually feel about this place?" Not the business answer. Actually. She was quiet for a moment, stirring. "I feel like it's a rock tied to my ankle," she said, and then immediately, "That came out wrong." "Did it?" "It's..." She turned down the heat and turned around, leaning against the counter. "When my mom was here, it was just home. I didn't think about whether it was viable, or if the roof was going to cost more than I could raise, or whether the off-season was going to last long enough to actually kill us. It was just the place I grew up." She looked around the kitchen. "Now it's all math, and the math doesn't work." He was watching her with that careful attention of his. "What would make the math work?" "A lot of money I don't have, or selling it." She turned back to the sauce. "Neither of which I'm willing to do." "So you're going to find a third option." "I'm going to find a third option," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "I like that about you." She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the sauce and did not say anything to that, because there was nothing safe to say to that. Not with his sister's letters sitting in the drawer 20 feet away, and the whole shape of what she wasn't telling him, pressing against the back of her teeth every time she opened her mouth. Thursday, she found him on the front porch in the morning, sitting in one of the old wooden chairs with a mug of coffee, looking out at the harbor. The storm had lightened overnight. Not gone, but gentler, the sky the color of worn denim, the water still choppy but no longer furious. She brought her own coffee and sat in the other chair, without asking if it was all right. "My daughter would love this," he said, without preamble. "The storm?" "The whole thing." He turned the mug in his hands. "She's been asking me to take her somewhere near the water, somewhere with boats and birds, and she read a book about lighthouses. She talks about it constantly." He smiled, and it was the first unguarded smile she'd seen from him, the kind that doesn't know it's being seen. "I keep telling her we'll plan a trip, and then I keep not planning it." "Why?" He thought about it. "Work. The easy answer is work." He watched a gull banking against the gray sky. "The honest answer is that it's just us, me and Sophie, and every time I try to plan something that's supposed to be good, fun, the kind of memory you mean to make, I get anxious that I'm going to get it wrong, that she's going to be disappointed, that I'm not enough to make it actually good." "You think that often? That you're not enough?" "More than I should," he said. She looked at the harbor, at the cold water, at the gulls. For what it's worth, from a person who runs a place people come to when they need quiet, the bar for a good trip isn't as high as you think. She'd probably be happy with the birds and a hot chocolate. He laughed softly. "Yeah? Kids that age are so much cheaper to impress than we think." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Maybe we'll come in the spring. Sophie and me." He looked over at her. "Would you have room?" "I'll make room," Claire said. She meant it. That was the problem. She genuinely meant it. The letters had been in that drawer since the second month after her mother died. She'd read the return address on the first one, E. Holloway, the Manhattan address, and known immediately who had sent them. Sent to Diana, to their mother's house, which meant Diana had given Ethan this address at some point, Probably during the marriage, probably during whatever period Diana had wanted some kind of connection to home or family or something she could point to and call roots. Claire had stared at the bundle for a long time the afternoon she found them. She had not opened them. She had told herself it was because they weren't hers to open, that Diana's correspondence was Diana's business, that she had no right. All of that was true. It was also true that she was afraid of what they said, because she'd heard her mother's version of the divorce. Diana's version, passed through their mother, heavily edited and simplified to something that made Diana the wounded party and Ethan the man who had failed her. And Claire had no reason at the time to question that version. She hadn't known Ethan. He was just the wealthy man her sister had briefly married. But letters. 7 letters, sent to a forwarding address, all unopened. Men who simply failed their marriages didn't write 7 letters they had no guarantee would ever be read. She knew that. She had known it since the afternoon she put them in the drawer. She had just been telling herself she was respecting someone's privacy, when really she was avoiding a problem she didn't have the energy to solve. And now the problem had a face, and he was sitting on her porch talking about his daughter and lighthouses. Thursday night, after dinner, she did something she hadn't planned. She went to the drawer. She opened it. She took out the bundle of letters and held them on her lap in the back room for a long time. She did not open them, but she looked at the handwriting on the outside of each envelope. Same pen. Careful, deliberate letters. The kind of handwriting that doesn't happen by accident. These were written slowly. She could see that. Not dashed off. Considered. She put them back, closed the drawer, went to bed, and lay awake for 2 hours. Friday morning, he came downstairs and said his brother had called. Apparently he knows I'm somewhere on the coast, Ethan said, accepting the coffee she handed him. He didn't look thrilled about it. I made the mistake of calling him yesterday. He wants to drive up. You don't want that. He worries, Ethan said. He means well. He set the mug down. He has opinions about how I spend my time, what's productive, what's not. And sitting in a storm-bound inn fixing pipes is firmly in the not column. Firmly. He almost smiled. I told him the road was still bad. The road is still bad, Claire said, which was technically true. There was still water in the low section, though a careful driver could get through. He looked at her, catching her tone. Thank you, he said, for not correcting me. I maintain no opinion about the road, she said, and went to make breakfast. Tot. She was washing up after breakfast when she heard him in the lobby. On the phone. She wasn't trying to listen, but the inn was small and old and sound moved through it at will. Sophie, what do you mean you told Mrs. Adler you wanted a lighthouse birthday? A pause. His voice was different when he was talking to his daughter. Less careful. More reactive. Like the control he kept on himself in adult conversation didn't quite apply. You can't just tell your teacher you want a lighthouse. What does that even... Another pause, and then a laugh, sudden and real. Okay, yeah. We'll figure out the lighthouse, Sophie. Quieter. I miss you too, Bug. Yeah, I know. 2 more days. The gentlest version of his voice. Okay. Good night. A pause. Then he was talking to someone else, an adult, and the careful, managed tone came back. She's fine, Marcus. I'm fine. Tell her good night from me. Claire went back to washing the dishes and did not think too hard about the feeling in her chest. Okay. Friday night, they sat by the fire later than they'd intended to. She'd opened the bottle of wine she'd been keeping, the actual good one, not the dining room house wine, because it had been a long week, and the storm was finally loosening, and it felt like a thing that should be marked somehow. He'd built up the fire while she found 2 glasses that matched, which was something of an accomplishment at this inn. They talked until almost midnight. He told her about Sophie, about the birthday that was coming up in March, about the way Sophie had been quietly, methodically, devastatingly working on him all year to get a dog, about the book series Sophie was obsessed with that featured a girl detective who solved crimes using birds as messengers. She told him about her mother, about the first time her mother had let her help cook at the inn when she was 7, and how she'd burned an entire batch of biscuits, and her mother had made her start over without any complaint or impatience. Just try again, baby. That's all cooking is. About how this inn, despite the math not working, was the only place she'd ever felt like she completely understood herself. That's not a small thing, he said. I know. She looked into her wine glass. Most people spend their whole lives looking for that. He was quiet for a moment. My office doesn't feel like that. My apartment doesn't feel like that. He looked around the small, slightly shabby, firelit room. Somewhere in this week, I stopped feeling like I was holding everything together. Maybe you weren't supposed to be holding everything together this week. Maybe. He looked at her. Not the polite, managed look he'd had that first evening. Something more direct. Something that required her to not look away. Claire. Yeah. I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to know I'm aware it might be an odd question. Okay? Why do I feel like I already know you? The fire made a small sound. Rain tapped at the window, softer than it had all week. She thought about the letters in the drawer, about Diana's face in photographs she hadn't looked at in years, about the 7 years of distance between the version of this man she'd heard about and the person sitting 3 feet from her now. I have that effect on people, she said. I'm a good listener. He held her gaze for a second longer, and she wasn't sure he believed her. Then he nodded slowly and looked back at the fire, and they sat in the kind of silence that had its own weight to it, comfortable and not comfortable at the same time, the way it feels when something is changing and you're not quite ready to name it. She locked up at midnight. She stood in the lobby for a moment after he'd gone upstairs, and she opened the drawer, and she looked at the letters again. 7 letters. His handwriting. Her sister's name. She thought about the conversation they'd just had, about the way he'd talked about his daughter, about the way he'd worked on that pipe for 90 minutes without being asked, about what he'd said on the porch. I keep getting it wrong. I'm not enough. She thought about what kind of man says that. Not to get sympathy, not to get something, just because it was true and he was too tired to dress it up. She thought about Diana. She thought about the version of events she'd grown up with. The careless, wealthy husband, the collapsed marriage, the sister who had been failed. She thought about 7 sealed letters. She put them back in the drawer. She turned off the front lobby light, all except the small one in the window, the one her mother had always kept burning. She went upstairs. And she did not sleep for a long time. The road cleared on Saturday morning. She knew it before she checked, could feel it in the way the inn was quiet. Not storm quiet, but the regular quiet of a place waiting for things to return to normal. He came downstairs at 8 with his bag. Her heart did something she told it not to do. Road's clear, she said. Yeah, he set the bag by the door. I should get back. Sophie's coming home Sunday and I need to, he gestured vaguely. I need to do the things I've been avoiding all week. That's usually how it works. He stood at the front desk while she put together his bill. She added up the nights, wrote it on the paper, pushed it across. He looked at it for a moment. This is not enough, he said. That's what the room costs. Claire. That's what the room costs, she said again, quietly but clearly. He looked at her. He did that thing he'd been doing all week, that careful reading, like he was trying to see past the surface of something. Then he took out his wallet and paid in cash, which surprised her, and he left a separate amount on the counter that was more than the bill and less than charity, if that makes sense. Enough to matter, not enough to be an argument. The pipe, he said, when she started to push it back. For the pipe. She left it there. He picked up his bag. At the door, he paused and looked back. Spring, he said. I meant it, Sophie and I. I'll have room, she said. I meant it too. He nodded once, pushed through the door. She listened to his footsteps on the porch, on the gravel, the sound of the car door. She stood at the window, the one with the small lamp, her mother's lamp, and watched the black car pull out of the lot and disappear down the road. She stood there for a while after it was gone. Then she went to the drawer. She opened it. She picked up the letters. This time, she sat down. She sat with the letters in her lap for a long time before she opened the first one. The lobby was quiet. The lamp in the window threw a small circle of yellow light across the floor. Outside, the harbor made its low, patient sounds. Water against wood. The occasional creak of a mooring line shifting weight. The storm had moved on, but left the air clean and cold in the way coastal storms do, like the atmosphere had been wrung out and hung to dry. She told herself she was opening them because she needed to know, because she couldn't keep carrying something this heavy without at least understanding what she was carrying. She peeled back the flap of the first envelope carefully, the way you do when you're still pretending you might not go through with it. The letter was dated 3 years ago. March. 3 months, she calculated quickly, after the divorce had been finalized. Diana, I'm not writing to argue or to relitigate anything. I know that won't accomplish anything, and I'm honestly too tired for it. I'm writing because Sophie asked about you last week. She asked why you don't come to her school things anymore. She's 4. I didn't know what to tell her. I want to be fair about this. I've tried to be fair. But I need you to know that whatever you've told your family about why we ended, I hope at some point you'll find a way to tell the truth. Not for me. I've accepted that I can't make you do that. But for Sophie, who is going to grow up and ask questions, and I'd like her to have access to accurate answers when she does. I'm not asking you to come back. I'm not asking for anything. I just need you to know that she's doing well, in case you care about that, and that I told her you love her, even though I'm not certain that's something you know how to do right now. Eclair sat with that letter for a long time. Then she opened the second one. She read all 7. By the time she got to the last one, written 14 months ago, shorter than the others, with less of the careful restraint that marked the early letters, she had a very clear picture of something she had suspected and spent years not wanting to confirm. The last letter was 3 paragraphs. In the second paragraph, Ethan wrote, I'm done trying to reach you, not because I'm angry, though I have been. I'm done because Sophie deserves to stop waiting for something that isn't coming, and I need to let her stop waiting. I'm going to stop telling her you might come to things. That's on me. Should have stopped saying it sooner. I don't know what version of our marriage you've been telling people. I have a reasonable guess. I just want you to know that the people in your life who believe that version don't know you the way I thought I did. And I'm sorry for that, genuinely. Because the person I thought you were was actually someone I could have loved a long time. That's the last I'll say. Claire folded the letters back into their envelopes. Her hands were steady. Her chest was not. She sat in the quiet lobby of her dead mother's inn, and she thought about Diana. The real Diana. Not the story of Diana. Not the wounded version her mother had eventually absorbed and retold. She thought about a 4-year-old girl asking why a woman had stopped coming to school things. She thought about a man who had written 7 careful letters to someone who had never opened a single one of them. She put the letters back in the drawer. She did not sleep at all that night. The inn stayed empty through the rest of November. She had 3 bookings in December, which was normal. A couple who came every year for their anniversary, a man who had been coming alone for 4 years and never explained why, and a family with young children who filled the hallways with noise and left the dining room in a state that took 2 hours to clean, but which Claire didn't mind because noise in the hallways was the opposite of what the inn sounded like the rest of the month. She kept the lamp in the front window burning. She didn't think about that consciously. She'd always kept it on. It was just what she did. But sometimes, locking up at night, she'd stand in the lobby and look at the glow of it against the dark outside and think about a man who had stopped because a light was on when everything else along the road was dark. She thought about the letters more than she wanted to. She thought about what she was supposed to do with them, which was a question she'd been avoiding for 2 years and could no longer pretend she wasn't avoiding. There was a difference between didn't know and couldn't face. She'd been in the second category the whole time, and knowing that wasn't comfortable. She could mail them. That was the obvious answer. Mail them to Ethan's address. She had it. She'd written it in the guest ledger, with a note explaining what they were and where she'd found them. She drafted that note 3 times on different occasions and deleted it each time, because the note required her to explain who she was. And explaining who she was meant explaining that she'd known, from the first moment he walked through the door, exactly who he was and what his connection was to her family. That was the wall she kept hitting, not the letters themselves. The before the letters, the week at the inn, the soup and the wine and the conversation on the porch about his daughter wanting to see a lighthouse, the way she'd felt during all of that, which was something she was also not ready to name directly. She started 3 emails and finished none of them. She told herself she'd figure it out after the holidays. January was brutal in the way January on the coast always was, gray and cold and long, with the kind of quiet that sat on you like weight. She had no guests. She had a leaking window in room 3 that she addressed with weather stripping and hope, a heating bill that made her close 2 of the upstairs rooms entirely, and a letter from the bank that she opened and then put in a drawer because she wasn't ready to fully face it yet. She cooked elaborate meals for herself because it was something to do. She repainted the hallway a slightly different shade of cream, not because it needed it, but because the act of repainting something felt like progress. She called her friend Joanna, who had grown up in the town and moved to Portland and called every few weeks with a cheerful insistence that Claire should also move to Portland. "The inn is never going to be financially sustainable," Joanna said on a Tuesday evening in January, in the gently brutal tone that only good friends can sustain. "You know that. Plenty of small inns." "Claire." "The summer season." "Claire." She was quiet. "I'm not saying give up," Joanna said, softer. "I'm saying you've been white-knuckling this alone for 18 months and you look exhausted every time we video call, and I want you to at least admit to yourself that you have options." "I don't want options," Claire said. "I want this to work." "Why?" "Because it's the last thing left that's hers." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "If I let it go, what does that leave?" Joanna was quiet for a moment. "You," she said finally. "It leaves you." Claire didn't have anything to say to that. She sat with the phone against her ear in the kitchen, looking at the copper pots her mother had hung on the wall 20 years ago, and she told herself she was not going to cry about this tonight, and she mostly succeeded. After she hung up, she went to the drawer in the lobby and looked at the letters for a while without touching them. Then she made tea, which was not a solution to anything, but was available. February came in cold and stayed that way. She'd been watching a window in the dining room that had been slowly separating from its frame, a gap she could get 2 fingers into on the worst days, which let in a draft that made the east side of the room nearly unusable. She'd priced out the repair, $400 for materials, probably another $600 for labor if she hired someone, or nothing if she could figure out how to do it herself. She was watching a tutorial video on her laptop at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. She almost didn't answer it, but it was February and she was lonely enough that an unknown number felt like company. "Is this Claire Bennett?" "It is." My name is Marcus Holloway. I'm Ethan Holloway's brother." The tutorial video kept playing on her laptop, a man demonstrating the correct application of Windows Sealant. She reached over and closed it. "Okay," she said. "I got your number from the inn's website. I hope that's all right." "Sure," she said. "What can I do for you?" A small pause, like he was recalibrating something. "My brother stayed at your inn back in November." "I remember." Marcus stopped, started over. "He talked about it. After. Not in detail, but he mentioned it more than he usually mentions things. Ethan doesn't talk about where he goes or what he does. He mentioned your inn." Claire was not sure where this was going, but she had a feeling starting in her stomach that she didn't like. "What is it you need, Mr. Holloway?" "I'd like to come up and see the place," Marcus said. "If that's possible. I'm in Boston for the week." "That's an hour-and-a-half drive in February." "I know. Why?" she asked directly, because she was tired and because the only polite thing she could do at this point was be honest. Another pause. This one felt more deliberate. "I have a business interest in coastal properties," he said. "Ethan's company, as you may know, does real estate development. I thought it might be worth a look." She sat with that for a moment. It was a reasonable explanation, and it was also, she was almost certain, not the whole explanation. "I don't have any interest in selling," she said. "I'm not necessarily talking about selling. There are other arrangements." "I'd have to think about it." "That's fair." He gave her his number. "Could I come Friday?" She looked out the kitchen window at the gray February harbor. She thought about the gap in the dining room window frame, the bank letter in the drawer, the mortgage that was not getting smaller on its own. "Friday's fine," she said. Marcus Holloway arrived on Friday at 11 in the morning in a car that was very similar to his brother's but somehow managed to feel more aggressive, which Claire suspected was intentional. He was 38, she guessed, with Ethan's dark coloring but a different bearing entirely. Where Ethan had been careful and contained, Marcus moved through space like he was accustomed to it accommodating him. He was not unpleasant. He shook her hand, accepted the coffee she offered, looked around the lobby with the particular attention of someone doing a professional assessment while pretending to make conversation. "It's a beautiful property," he said, which was the right thing to say and probably also true. "Thank you. The bones are excellent. The location is exceptional." He looked at the harbor through the front windows. "I can see why Ethan liked it." Claire said. He turned to look at her then, and she had the feeling of someone shifting from preamble to actual subject. "Can I be direct with you, Ms. Bennett?" "Please." My brother is not in a good place. He said it plainly, without drama, but also without softening. He's been running on empty for 3 years. He works too much. He doesn't sleep enough. And he has a 6-year-old daughter who needs more of him than he's been able to give because he's been keeping himself together with business and routine. He paused. He came back from this trip in November, different, not dramatically, but I've known him his whole life, and there was something eased in him that I haven't seen in years. Claire kept her face neutral. I'm glad the stay was restful. It wasn't just the stay. Marcus looked at her steadily. He mentioned you. I'm sure he was being polite. Ethan is not polite, Marcus said. He's courteous, which is different. Polite people say what's expected. Ethan doesn't mention things unless they matter to him. She was quiet. Marcus turned his coffee cup on the table. I looked you up, Miss Bennett, after he came home. There it was. She'd known it was coming, felt it in the architecture of the conversation, the way you can see the shape of a wave before it arrives. And, she said, and I know who your sister is. His voice was even. Not accusatory, not warm, just even. I know that Diana Bennett was married to my brother for 2 years. I know how that ended. He met her eyes. And I know that you knew who he was when he walked through your door. The dining room was very quiet. A gull went past the window. Yes, Claire said. I did. You didn't tell him. No. Why not? She thought about how to answer that. The honest answer had several layers, and she wasn't sure she owed him all of them. Because I didn't know how, she said finally. And because I was afraid. Marcus studied her for a moment. Afraid of what? That it would ruin the week. She said it quietly, but without apology. He came here because he needed somewhere to put everything down for a little while. I didn't want to be the reason he picked it back up. Something moved across Marcus's face. He looked out at the harbor, and for a moment he seemed less like a man with an agenda and more like someone who was genuinely trying to figure something out. There's something else, he said. There usually is. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and came out with an envelope. He set it on the table between them, face down. I found this in Ethan's apartment, in a file he keeps with things from the marriage. I think Diana sent it to him after the divorce. I don't think he's ever gone back to read it. Claire didn't touch the envelope. Why are you showing it to me? Because whatever's in it, Marcus said, is connected to what happened between them, and you have information that might help Ethan understand that period of his life. Specifically, he paused. I know there were letters he wrote to Diana that were never delivered. Our mother mentioned it once, years ago, and then never again. Claire's hands were very still on the table. I don't know where those letters are, Marcus said, but if they exist, and if they ever surfaced, that would be complicated. For Ethan. He's finally in a stable place. He's finally moving forward. He looked at her directly. I'd like things to stay uncomplicated. There it was, laid out in plain language. You're asking me not to tell him, Claire said. I'm asking you to think about timing. Marcus turned the envelope over. She could see now that it was sealed, addressed in handwriting she recognized as Diana's, the large looping letters she'd always had, and about whether some truths serve a purpose or whether they just blow things up, Claire finished. Yes. She looked at the envelope, at the coffee between them, at the harbor out the window, cold and flat and going nowhere. And if I did decide to tell him, she said slowly, you'd prefer I not do that. I'd prefer my brother not get hurt again. By the truth? By the circumstances around the truth, Marcus said precisely. There's a difference. She thought about that. It was not entirely wrong as distinctions went. Circumstances mattered. Context mattered. The fact that she'd spent a week with this man under false pretenses, even kind ones, even well-intentioned ones, was not a small thing. She knew that. But she also thought about those letters. About a 4-year-old girl asking why a woman had stopped coming to school things. About the people in your life who believe that version don't know you the way I thought I did. What's in it for you? She asked. I mean specifically, not the version about protecting your brother, the real version. Marcus looked at her without flinching, which she respected. I've spent 3 years helping him put himself back together, he said. I'm not going to watch someone from Diana's family take him apart again. It was honest, at least. Ugly in the way honest things sometimes were, but honest. "I see," she said. "There's also this." He reached back into his coat and set something else on the table. A check. Her name on it. A number that made her breath catch somewhere in her throat. "For repairs," he said. "No conditions on how it's spent. The inn needs work and you need capital. That's just a fact." She looked at the check for a long time. The gap in the dining room window frame, the bank letter, the $400 for materials she didn't have, the third option she'd told Ethan she would find. She picked up the check. She looked at it. She set it back down. "No," she said. Marcus didn't move. "Ms. Bennett." "No," she said again, and her voice was quiet, but it was not uncertain. "I understand what you're doing, and I understand why you're doing it, and I'm not going to take your money. Not for this. It's not Mr. Holloway." She looked at him. "If I wanted to be paid to keep quiet about inconvenient things, I had that option for 2 years before your brother ever walked through my door. I didn't take it then either." She pushed the check back across the table. "I'm going to figure out the inn on my own. I've been doing it on my own." He studied her for a moment. Then he picked up the check and folded it back into his pocket. "What are you going to do?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I'm going to do it without taking money from someone who wants something from me." He stood, buttoned his coat. He looked, she thought, like a man who had come here expecting one outcome and was leaving with something he hadn't prepared for. At the door, he turned back. "He's planning to bring his daughter in March," he said. "Spring, he told me." "I know," Claire said. "He's looking forward to it." "I know that too." Marcus looked at her for a moment with something that might have been reluctant respect or might have been calculation. She couldn't quite tell which and thought it was probably both. Then he nodded once and left. She sat at the table for a long time after his car pulled out of the lot. Then she went to the lobby. She opened the drawer. She took out the bundle of letters, all 7 of them, still in their envelopes, still in the rubber band her mother had put around them for reasons Claire had never asked about, and now never could. She set them on the desk in front of her. The weeks after Marcus's visit were the longest of the winter. She knew what she needed to do. She'd known it, if she was honest, since the night she'd read the letters. Maybe since the moment she'd first seen Ethan Holloway's name on the guest ledger, his handwriting careful and deliberate. But knowing what you need to do and doing it are separated by an enormous amount of ordinary time. The kind of time you fill with cooking and repainting hallways and watching window repair tutorials and calling friends in Portland who tell you things you aren't ready to hear. She drafted the letter to him 6 times. The first draft was too formal. It read like a legal document, which was not what she was going for, but was what happened when she was nervous and defaulted to precision. The second was too emotional in the wrong direction, too apologetic in the way that asks for absolution rather than giving information. The third was fine, but she read it back and thought about him reading it and decided fine was not enough. She deleted them all and started over. What she settled on, eventually, was not long. She told him who she was, who Diana was to her, what she'd known when he checked in, and why she'd made the choice she'd made. She told him about the letters, that she'd found them in her mother's things, that she hadn't opened them for 2 years and then had, and that what she found in them had changed what she understood about what had happened between him and her sister. She told him she was sorry for every day she'd sat across from him or worked beside him or talked to him by the fireplace and not said the true thing. She did not ask him to call her. She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not suggest that they continue anything. She just wrapped the 7 letters back in their rubber band, put them in a padded envelope with her letter on top, sealed it, and drove to the post office before she could read it again and change her mind. March arrived. The coast changed in March in ways that were subtle and then suddenly obvious. The quality of light shifted. Something in the air turned less like an ending and more like a hesitation before something new. The harbor came back to life by degrees. A few fishing boats that had been dry docked, the marina's seasonal staff returning, the small bait shop at the end of the dock propping its door open during the warmest hours of the afternoon. Claire repainted the front porch. It needed it. The paint had been peeling at the corners since the previous summer, and she'd been meaning to address it since October. She did it herself over the course of 3 days, in the cold and the slanted March light, and it looked better when she was done. Not perfect. It would need doing again in a couple of years. But better. She fixed the dining room window with the help of a different tutorial video and a man at the hardware store named Don who spent 15 minutes explaining exactly what she needed and then carried the materials to her car without being asked. She opened 2 of the upstairs rooms she'd closed in January and turned the heat back on and cleaned them thoroughly, which took most of a Monday. She did not hear from Ethan. She had not expected to, necessarily. She'd told him she didn't need a reply. She'd meant it. But there was a difference between not needing something and not feeling its absence, and the absence of a response had a specific weight to it that she carried around the inn with her through the second week of March, while she restocked the kitchen and replaced the bulbs in the hallway fixtures and tried not to check her phone. On the 15th, she got an email from a travel blog that wanted to do a feature on small coastal inns. She wrote back. On the 16th, she got a call from a woman who wanted to book room 4 for a week in April for what she described as a writing retreat, which was a term Claire associated with people who arrived with ambitious intentions and left having mostly read and eaten well, which was fine. That was what the inn was for. On the 17th, in the late afternoon, she heard a car in the lot. She was in the kitchen. She heard gravel, a door, 2 sets of footsteps on the porch. One heavier, one quick and light. The pattern of a small person who is moving at speed, because moving at speed is the natural state of someone that age. The bell above the front door rang. She wiped her hands on her apron. She walked out of the kitchen. Ethan was standing in the lobby with a 6-year-old girl who had his dark hair and a coat that was slightly too big for her and both arms wrapped around a stuffed penguin that had clearly been loved to the point of structural compromise. He looked at Claire. She looked at him. She had prepared something to say. She'd been preparing it for weeks, a version of hello that would acknowledge everything without requiring anything. She'd rehearsed the exact neutral, composed way she would greet him. What she said was, "You came." What he said was, "I said I would." The girl looked up at Claire with the direct, assessing attention that small children have before they learn to be polite about it. "Is this the inn with the lighthouse?" she said. "The lighthouse is down the road," Claire said, crouching down to the girl's level without thinking about it. "But you can see it from the front porch. It's got a red top." Sophie Holloway considered this information seriously. "Does it still work?" "Not since 1987, but it's still standing." Sophie looked at her penguin, then back at Claire as if consulting. "Does anyone live there?" "Seabirds," Claire said. "Mostly gulls." "Gulls are mean," Sophie said with the confidence of someone who has decided things. "They are, actually," Claire agreed. "They'll steal your lunch." Sophie looked up at her father. "She knows about gulls," she said with a tone that indicated this was a point in Claire's favor. Ethan was watching Claire in a way she couldn't quite read. There was something complicated moving behind his eyes. Not anger, she didn't think, or at least not only that, something more layered. She stood up slowly and met his gaze. "I got your letter," he said. Quietly, because Sophie was already drifting toward the armchairs by the fireplace with the focused interest of a child discovering a new space. "I know," Claire said. "I wasn't sure you'd—" She stopped. "I didn't know what you'd do with it." "I didn't either," he said. "For a while." Sophie had climbed into one of the armchairs and was holding her penguin up toward the fireplace in what appeared to be an introduction. "Room 4's ready," Claire said, because she didn't know what else to say, and someone had to say something practical. "Same room as before." "Good," he said. He picked up his bag. She watched him go to the bottom of the stairs and call his daughter, who extracted herself from the chair with visible reluctance and came running with the penguin under her arm. At the bottom of the stairs, Ethan turned back. "Claire," he said. She waited. "I read them," he said. "All of them." She nodded. There was nothing useful to add to that. He looked at her for one more moment. That careful, reading look she'd come to recognize, the one that didn't rush itself. And then he went upstairs. She stood in the lobby and listened to footsteps above her, the small, quick ones and the heavier, deliberate ones, and the sound of a child's voice asking something she couldn't make out, and then Ethan's voice answering, low and patient. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the counter and looked at the copper pots on the wall and thought about how her mother had always said that the inn had a way of bringing people back. She'd said it like it was something she'd observed, a property of the place itself, the way some places hold warmth and other places don't. Claire had always thought it was a nice thing to say, a sentimental thing. The kind of comfort you offer to a building as much as to anyone. She put a pot of water on to boil and started thinking about dinner, and she thought her mother might have been right after all. Dinner that first evening was chicken with roasted vegetables and bread she'd made that afternoon. The same bread she always made when she didn't know what else to do with her hands. Sophie ate with the focused intensity of a child who had been in a car for 2 hours and was making up for lost time, and she talked, not nervously, not performatively, but in the continuous associative way that 6-year-olds talk when they feel comfortable, jumping from the penguin's name, Gerald, she explained, because he looked like a Gerald, to the book she'd been reading in the car, to a detailed account of a disagreement she'd had with a classmate named Priya over whether penguins could theoretically live at the North Pole if someone moved them there. They could survive, Sophie said, with the authority of someone who had given this genuine thought. The temperature is right, but they'd be confused. About what? Claire asked. The other animals. They don't know polar bears. Sophie considered her bread. Gerald would be okay because Gerald is brave, but regular penguins would probably be nervous. Ethan was watching his daughter with the expression Claire had noticed before. The unguarded one. The one that didn't know it was being seen. Something about it hurt in a way she didn't examine closely. Where did you read about polar bears and penguins? He asked. I didn't read it, I thought it, Sophie said, as though this distinction were obvious. You thought the whole polar bear penguin migration theory. Yes, by yourself. Dad. Sophie gave him a look of patient exhaustion that was too old for her face by about 30 years. I think things by myself all the time. Claire pressed her mouth together to keep from laughing. Ethan caught her doing it, and something shifted briefly in his expression. Not quite a smile, not yet, but the infrastructure of one. After dinner, Sophie fell asleep on the armchair by the fireplace before Ethan had finished clearing the table, still holding Gerald, one sock half off, with the totality of unconsciousness that children have when they've decided they're done being awake. Ethan came to the doorway of the dining room and looked at her, and then looked at Claire. I should get her upstairs, he said. I'll get the fire banked. He carried Sophie up without waking her, which was clearly something he'd done enough times that he had a system. The particular angle of holding that avoided the creaky third stair, the way he shifted her weight at the landing. Claire watched him go and then turned to the fireplace and did something useful with her hands. She was in the kitchen washing up when she heard him come back downstairs. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. She's out, he said. She earned it. Gerald's philosophical dilemmas alone would exhaust most adults. He almost smiled again. He was still doing that. Almost, but not quite, like the full version of it required something to be settled first. Do you want tea? She asked. Or there's the rest of that wine from dinner. Tea is fine. She put the kettle on. He sat at the kitchen table, which was where he'd sat in November when she'd been making the 3-hour sauce, and the familiarity of it had an edge to it now. The same table, the same kitchen, but with everything that had been unspoken in November now said and sitting between them like something that had been set down and not yet picked up. I want to ask you something, he said, while she was getting mugs down. His voice was level, careful. Okay. In November, that first night, when I walked in and gave you my name, he paused. What did you feel? She set the mugs on the counter. The kettle was heating. Outside, the March harbor was dark and quiet. Like the floor had moved, she said honestly. But you didn't say anything. No. Why not right then? Not the whole week, just that first moment. Why not just say, I know who you are, this is a strange situation. Do you want me to call someone else? She turned around and leaned against the counter. He was watching her the way he always watched things he was trying to understand, without judgment in his face, but with a quality of attention that didn't let you get away with approximate answers. Because you looked exhausted, she said, and because you'd driven to the end of a coastal road in a November storm and stopped at a dark inn because there was a light on, and because something in me, she stopped. Something in me thought that whatever you needed, it wasn't more complicated information. That wasn't your call to make. I know. I told you things, that week. His voice stayed even, but there was something moving underneath it. About Sophie, about... He stopped himself. I said things I don't say to people. I know that too. And the whole time, I knew, she said. Yes. He was quiet. The kettle started to whistle, and she turned and poured water into the mugs and brought them to the table and sat down across from him, because this conversation required sitting down across from someone and not hiding behind the act of making tea. "I found the letters in a box of my mother's things," she said, before he could continue. 14 months after she died. I didn't know they existed. Diana had apparently given your address to my mother at some point during your marriage, and when the letters started coming, my mother kept them. I don't know why. I don't know if she meant to give them to Diana, or if she just couldn't bring herself to send them back or throw them away. She wrapped her hands around her mug. "I found them, and I didn't open them for 2 years. "Why not?" "Because I'd only ever heard one version of what happened between you and Diana," she said. "My mother's version, which was Diana's version, and I was—" She thought about the right word. "I was afraid that opening them would mean having to reckon with the fact that the version I'd been given wasn't complete." He was watching her. "Was it?" "Incomplete." "Very," she said quietly. He looked down at his tea. Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly. More like the particular expression of someone hearing a thing confirmed that they'd suspected for so long it had stopped feeling like suspicion and started feeling like a fact they just couldn't prove. "What happened with you and Diana?" he asked. "You said you two weren't speaking by the time of the wedding." "We stopped speaking over our mother's medical bills," Claire said, "which was the official reason. The real reason was that we'd been running out of room for each other for years, and the bills gave us an excuse to make it formal." She paused. "Diana wanted a different life than the one we'd grown up in. She wanted it very badly, and she was—" Claire chose her words carefully, not from protectiveness of Diana, but from precision. "She was someone who was very good at making people believe they were giving her what she needed, when actually she was taking it." The kitchen was very quiet. "I know," Ethan said. "Just that. I'm not trying to—" "Pooh! I know," he said again. "You're not telling me anything I haven't had years to figure out." He turned his mug in his hands. "What I didn't know was how much of what she told people about the marriage was—" He stopped, started again. "She told her family I'd been emotionally absent, focused only on work, that she'd tried to make things work, and I'd been checked out." Claire said nothing. "Was that what you'd been told?" he asked. "Approximately," she said. "Yes." He nodded slowly, not surprised. Still something that looked like the confirmation of an old and tiresome pain. "I was focused on work," he said. "I won't pretend I wasn't. Sophie's mother, we were never married. That was a different situation entirely. And when she left, I was 26 with a 2-year-old and a company that was at a critical point, and I made choices about where my attention went that weren't always the right ones." He paused. "But I was there. I showed up. And when I started to understand what Diana actually wanted versus what she said she wanted, I tried to have that conversation, and she—" He stopped. "You don't have to explain it to me," Claire said. "I know." He looked at her. "I think I want to, though, because you spent a week with me, and you knew who I was, and you made a decision to let things be what they were without telling me. And I'm trying to understand if you were protecting something or just avoiding something." The directness of it landed cleanly. She didn't flinch from it. "Both," she said. "I think it was both." He nodded. He didn't look angry exactly, but he didn't look resolved either. He looked like a man in the middle of something, which was fair because he was. "I need to think," he said. "Okay. Not about whether I'm glad I came back. I know the answer to that." He looked up. "About the rest of it." She nodded. She understood what he was asking for, even without him saying it directly. Space inside this visit to be here and not here at the same time. To let Sophie see the lighthouse and pet a gull and eat good food and sleep in a room with good water pressure while he worked through the architecture of what he'd been handed. "Room 4 has extra blankets in the closet," she said. Sophie looked cold in the car. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. "Thank you," he said. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night." She washed the mugs after he went upstairs. She stood at the kitchen sink and looked at her own reflection in the dark window above it, distorted slightly by the old glass, and she thought about the conversation they'd just had and thought it had gone as well as she had any right to expect. That was the night Marcus arrived. She didn't know he was coming. That was the thing she kept returning to in the days that followed. Not as an excuse, but as a fact that mattered. She had not known. She had not prepared. What happened in real time, without rehearsal, which meant that when it went wrong in the irreversible way that unrehearsed things do. She heard the car at 9:15. Ethan was upstairs. Sophie was asleep. Claire was in the lobby with a book she hadn't actually been reading, sitting in one of the armchairs by the window when headlights swept across the front of the inn. She knew the car. She'd seen it once before, in February, in the same lot. She got to the door before Marcus could knock and stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door mostly closed behind her. The night was cold and clear, the harbor a dark mirror below the road. "Mr. Holloway," she said, keeping her voice low, "this isn't a good time." Marcus looked at her. He'd driven up from wherever he'd been without calling ahead, which told her something about the state he was in. He looked less composed than he had in February. His coat was open, his expression tight in a way that suggested several hours of wrestling with the decision. "Is he here?" he said. "He's here." "Does he know?" He meant about her, about Diana, about all of it. "We talked," she said. Something flickered in his face. "What did you tell him?" "The truth," Claire said. "Most of it. We're still working through it." Marcus looked past her at the closed door. "He called me this afternoon. From the road, before he got here. He sounded—" Marcus stopped. "He sounded like he did at the beginning, when everything was falling apart." "He's not falling apart. He's thinking. You don't know him the way I do." "No," she said. "I don't." Marcus looked at her steadily. "What is it you think is going to happen here, Ms. Bennett? You tell him everything. He forgives you for the deception. And then what? He starts coming to this inn on weekends? He integrates you into his life, his daughter's life, and 6 months from now it goes wrong the way things always go wrong and Sophie is the one who pays for it?" His voice was controlled, but there was heat in it, the heat of something he'd been containing for a long time. She already lost one person who was supposed to be a constant. Diana walked out and never looked back, and Sophie was 4 years old. "I know how old she was," Claire said quietly. "Then you understand why I'm not willing to let someone else do that to her." "I'm not Diana." "No," Marcus said. "Diana was upfront about what she wanted. You spent a week lying to my brother by omission. It landed hard, the way true things do when someone delivers them without flinching." "I've already acknowledged that," she said. "Acknowledging it isn't the same as it not having happened." They stood on the porch in the cold, and Claire thought about what she wanted to say and how much of it was defensible, and how much of it was just the impulse to protect herself, and she tried to be honest about the difference. "What do you want from this visit?" she asked. "I want to see my brother. He's inside, and it's 9:30, and his daughter is asleep." "I'll be quiet." "Marcus!" The front door opened. Ethan stood in the doorway in the sweater he'd worn at dinner, looking from Claire to his brother with an expression that shifted rapidly from confusion to something more contained and careful. "Marcus," he said. His voice was flat in the way voices get when someone is managing their reaction. "Hey." Marcus stepped up onto the porch. "I was in the area, I thought—" "You weren't in the area," Ethan said. "It's 9:30 on a Tuesday, and you drove an hour and a half. What's going on?" Marcus looked at Claire, and Ethan tracked that look with the precision of someone who had known Marcus his whole life and understood exactly what it meant when his brother looked at someone instead of answering a question. "What?" Ethan said. "Can we talk inside?" Marcus said. "You can talk here. Claire." He glanced at her. "Whatever it is, she can hear it." Marcus was quiet for a moment. The decision moved across his face, the kind of decision that people make when they've had something planned and are realizing the plan has already been overtaken by events. "I came here in February," Marcus said. Ethan went still. "I called ahead. I drove up and I met with Ms. Bennett." He paused. "I knew who she was before you did. I found out when I looked her up in November, after you came home talking about this inn. I knew Diana was her sister." Ethan looked at Claire. She met his eyes and didn't look away because looking away would be the wrong thing. "And?" Ethan said, still looking at her. "And I came up to assess the situation," Marcus said. "To make sure—" "You offered me money," Claire said. It came out steady. "He offered me money to keep quiet and not tell you who I was. I said no." Silence. Ethan turned to his brother. Marcus didn't deny it. I wanted to protect you, he said. You wanted to manage me, Ethan said. His voice had gone very quiet, which was, Claire was beginning to understand, a sign of how serious it was. Ethan's anger didn't get loud. It got quiet and precise and extremely clear. You drove up here and offered a woman money to stay out of my life without telling me you'd done it, without asking me what I wanted. You would have come up here anyway. Yes, Ethan said, I would have, because I'm an adult and it was my decision to make, mine. He looked at his brother for a long moment. How long have you been making decisions for me, Marcus? I haven't. The Carlisle deal last year. You pulled that without consulting me because you decided it would stress me out. The timing was the thing with Sophie's school. You talked to the admissions director before I did because you decided I'd say the wrong thing. Marcus was quiet. I do not need you to manage my life, Ethan said. I need you to trust me to live it. You were in pieces, Marcus said, and the control in his voice slipped slightly, just at the edges. After Diana, you were in actual pieces, and you wouldn't let anyone help, and I watched you hold yourself together for 3 years through sheer... He stopped, looked at the porch floor. I'm not sorry for worrying about you. I'm not going to pretend I am. I know, Ethan said. I know that. Something in him eased slightly, not resolved, but less rigid. But what you did wasn't worry. What you did was make a choice on my behalf that you had no right to make. And now I'm standing here finding out about it, which means the whole time I've been here... He stopped himself. He turned to Claire. This was the part she'd been bracing for. She could feel it coming, had felt it coming since the moment the door opened and Ethan appeared on the porch. You knew he came here, Ethan said. Yes. You didn't tell me. No. He offered you money and you turned it down and you still didn't tell me he'd come. I was going to... She stopped herself from finishing that sentence because I was going to tell you when the time was right was not a defense, it was a continuation of the same pattern he'd just articulated. I made another choice not to say something, she said instead. I thought I was protecting the visit, what you and Sophie were having here. I didn't want to introduce something that would... I didn't want to put Marcus in the room when what was already between us was hard enough. But that wasn't your call, Ethan said. The same words he'd used in the kitchen earlier in the evening, in a conversation that now felt like it had happened in a different chapter. That's a pattern, Claire. You keep making calls that aren't yours to make. She didn't argue. She couldn't. He was right. I know, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, that careful reading look, but this time it was looking for something different than it had been looking for before, and whatever it found, she couldn't tell. His face closed in a way it hadn't been closed with her since the first evening of November, when he'd been a stranger and she'd handed him a room key and kept everything behind the desk. I need to think, he said. It was what he'd said in the kitchen, but this time it had a different weight. He went inside. Marcus stood on the porch looking like a man who had accomplished nothing and broken something and knew both things simultaneously. I was trying to help him, he said, not to her exactly. More to the cold air. I know, she said. She went inside and left Marcus on the porch with that. The next morning was the worst morning. She woke early and lay in bed listening to the inn and trying to gauge what kind of day it was going to be from the sounds of it, the way she'd been doing since childhood. Her mother had done it too, reading the mood of the building the way farmers read weather. She could hear Sophie moving around upstairs, the light quick footsteps, the sound of a door, then Ethan's voice, low, inaudible, then Sophie again. She got up and made breakfast because guests needed breakfast, and because she didn't know what else to do. Sophie came downstairs at 7:30 in her pajamas with Gerald under her arm and informed Claire that Gerald needed to see the lighthouse today because she had promised him. After breakfast, Claire said, he says after breakfast is acceptable. Sophie climbed onto a kitchen stool. He says he would like eggs. Gerald eats eggs? Sophie looked at her with the expression of someone dealing with an obvious misunderstanding. He doesn't eat them. He just likes to know they're there. Okay, Claire said. Eggs it is. She made eggs and toast and juice, and Sophie ate and talked about Gerald's opinions on coastal geography, and Claire cooked and responded and kept her eyes on the pan because if she looked at Sophie's face too long, she was going to feel something she couldn't afford to feel in a kitchen at 7:30 in the morning. Ethan came downstairs at 8. He sat at the table and drank coffee and said good morning and ate the breakfast she put in front of him, and they were all three very polite to each other in the careful way of people navigating something fragile. Sophie didn't notice. Sophie was constructing an elaborate argument for why Gerald should get to come to the lighthouse in her coat pocket rather than her bag. After breakfast, Ethan took Sophie to the lighthouse. Claire watched them go from the front porch, Sophie ahead already at a run, calling back something about the red top, and Ethan behind her with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the ground between his feet. He walked like a man who was thinking so hard he was barely inside his body. He didn't look back. She went inside and cleaned the kitchen and tried not to assign meaning to that. They were gone for 2 hours. She occupied herself with things that needed doing: the dining room, the supply inventory she'd been putting off, a call with Dawn from the hardware store about a gutter on the north side that was pulling away from the fascia and would need to be addressed before summer. She was professional and efficient, and she did not once go to the front window to check whether a black car was still in the lot. She checked 3 times. It was still there. That had to count for something. When they came back, Sophie's nose was red from the cold, and she was holding a feather that she explained had come from a gull who had been rude to her near the water's edge, and she had kept the feather as evidence. "Of what?" Claire asked. "Of the crime," Sophie said very seriously. "The crime of being rude?" "You have to document everything," Sophie said, with an authority that suggested she'd heard this somewhere and absorbed it completely. She went upstairs to add the feather to what she described as her investigation materials, which apparently occupied the lower shelf of the closet in room 4. Ethan stood in the lobby. "She has investigation materials," Claire said. "She brought a folder," he said, "for the trip. I found out about the folder on the drive up." He paused. "I didn't question it." "Probably wise." A beat of silence, not the easy kind. "I talked to Marcus last night after you went inside," Ethan said. "He drove back around midnight." "How did it go?" "Like most conversations with Marcus. We said the things that needed to be said, and then we were both too tired to keep going." He looked at the floor briefly. "He's not a bad person. He's a person who loves me and doesn't trust that I can handle things, which is a very specific kind of problem to have with someone." "Are you okay?" He considered the question without deflecting it. "I don't know yet." She nodded. That was an honest answer. He crossed the lobby and sat in one of the armchairs by the cold fireplace. The fire wasn't lit yet. It was mid-morning, and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. He was looking at the floor. She sat in the chair across from him because that seemed to be what was needed. "I've been thinking about the week in November," he said. She waited. "I told you things." He looked up. "Things I told you because I felt like you were someone I could tell them to. And now I'm looking back at that week and trying to figure out which parts were real and which parts were—" He stopped. "I don't know. Constructed." "Nothing was constructed," she said. "I didn't make you feel anything. I didn't manage you. You didn't tell me who you were." "No," she said. "I didn't. And I'm not going to keep saying I was wrong about that because I've said it and I mean it, and saying it again isn't going to make it more true." She held his gaze. "But the week was real. The conversations were real. Whatever you felt it on your own. I didn't engineer any of it." He was quiet. "The problem," he said slowly, "is that I can't separate them. The week and the secret. They're the same thing to me now. And every time I try to remember what it felt like to sit on that porch and talk about Sophie wanting to see a lighthouse, I hit the wall of knowing you had information I didn't, and you chose to keep it." "I understand." "I don't think you do," he said, not unkindly, "because you have context that I don't. You knew your sister. You knew what had happened. You could look at me and calibrate what I was. Adjust your understanding of the situation as you went. I was operating completely blind." That was the most direct he'd been, and it landed exactly where he meant it to. "You're right," she said. "I did have that, and I used it to make decisions about your experience without asking you. That was wrong." He leaned back in the chair, looked at the ceiling. She watched his face, the way things moved across it when he was thinking. It was a face that didn't hide much when it wasn't trying to. "I came back here," he said, to the ceiling, "because I read your letter, and I read those letters And something in me said this isn't finished, that there's something here worth. He stopped. But I don't know how to trust my own read on it, because my read on people hasn't historically been very good. Diana wasn't your fault. Maybe not, but I chose her. I looked at someone who was showing me who she was, and I decided what I wanted to see instead. He looked back down. How do I know I'm not doing that again? It was the most honest question he'd asked, and she understood immediately that it wasn't rhetorical. He was asking her, asking the woman who had kept a secret from him for a week, whether she was currently showing him who she was or what he wanted to see. The audacity of the question was almost architectural in its precision. "You don't," she said. "Not for certain. That's just being a person. You make your read and you hold it loosely enough to revise it." He looked at her for a long time. "The letters," he said finally. She waited. "In the last one I wrote to Diana," he said, "I said something I've thought about a lot since. I said the person I thought she was someone I could have loved for a long time." He paused. "I meant it as something sad, a grief statement. The version of her I'd believed in wasn't real, so it was like losing someone who hadn't existed." "I know," Claire said softly. "I read that one too. But sitting here," he stopped himself, looked at the cold fireplace. "I'm not going to finish that sentence right now. Okay? I need more time." "There's time," she said. "The room is yours as long as you want it." He looked at her. One more of those careful, searching looks, the kind that had always felt like they were looking for something specific. And then he nodded slowly and stood up. "I'm going to take Sophie to that bait shop down at the marina," he said. "She wants to see the boats. Don't let her get too close to the water. The dock's slippery this time of year." He looked at her with something that was almost exasperation and almost gratitude. "I know how to take my daughter to a marina, Claire." "I know you do," she said. "I was nervous and it came out as advice." He stood there for a moment, and she thought she heard something shift in him, very slightly, the way a lock opens when someone finally tries the right key and doesn't even know they're doing it. "Nervous," he repeated. "Yes." He considered that. Then he went upstairs to get Sophie. She sat alone by the cold fireplace and thought about what he'd said. "I'm not going to finish that sentence right now." She turned those words over and tried to understand the shape of what was left unfinished inside them, and she thought that whatever it was not nothing. That was both the best and hardest thing about where they were. Nothing about it was nothing. The blow came that afternoon while they were out. She was in the back hallway reattaching a section of baseboard that had been pulling away from the wall when she heard her phone. A text from a number she didn't recognize, which turned out to be Marcus. "I told him everything this morning, before the lighthouse. He knows you knew I came in February from the beginning. He knows I offered you money. And he knows something else I should have told him when I first found out, that you spoke to Diana 3 months ago." She sat back on her heels and stared at the screen. She had spoken to Diana. That was true. In December, a brief and difficult phone call that Diana had initiated. The first contact in 4 years, during which Diana had been strange and vague and not quite present in the way she sometimes got. And Claire had told her about the letters, about finding them, about not knowing what to do with them. Diana had gone quiet and then said something Claire hadn't known what to do with. "Don't send them. It won't help him. Let it be done." Claire had not followed that advice, but she had not told anyone about the call either. She typed back, "When did you tell him?" Marcus's response came fast. "This morning, before they left for the lighthouse." She put the phone down on the floor and looked at the baseboard she'd been fixing and thought about Ethan at the lighthouse with Sophie. Ethan walking back across the road to the inn, Ethan sitting in the armchair and having the conversation they'd just had, knowing more than he'd let on. Or maybe not knowing what to do with what Marcus had told him. Or maybe working through it in real time while she thought they were just talking. She didn't know which. She couldn't know. She picked up her tools and went back to the baseboard because the baseboard needed fixing and she needed something concrete to do. But she was already thinking about the shape of his face when he'd said, "I'm not going to finish that sentence right now." And she was wondering now whether the sentence had already been decided, and she just hadn't been told. When his car pulled out of the lot 3 hours later and didn't come back, she understood. She went to the window. She watched the taillights disappear around the curve in the road. The lot was empty. The harbor was going dark in the early evening, the light falling back from the water the way it did this time of year. On the front desk was a check, face down. She turned it over. It was more than the room cost. Not the extravagant kind of more. Just enough to cover what was owed and leave a little, the way he'd done in November. There was no note, just the check. She looked at it for a long time. Then she opened the guest ledger and looked at the line where she'd written his name in November, in handwriting that hadn't shaken. And she thought about everything that had started in that moment and followed from it and arrived here. An empty parking lot and a check for the right amount left face down on a desk. She had not been abandoned. She understood that. He was not Diana. He hadn't done what Diana had done. But he had gone. And that was also true. And the inn was very quiet in the particular way it got when the last guest had checked out. She put the check in the drawer. She went to the kitchen. She made dinner for one, which was something she had done many times and was good at. And she ate it alone at the kitchen table with the copper pots on the wall and the harbor going fully dark outside. And she thought about what her mother had said about this place bringing people back. She thought about how that wasn't actually a promise. It was just something her mother had noticed or wanted to believe. Observation wasn't guarantee. Some things came back, some things didn't. The lamp in the front window was still on. She left it burning the way she always did, and she went to bed. She gave herself 3 days. That was the agreement she made with herself the morning after the empty parking lot and the face-down check and the dinner for one. 3 days to feel whatever needed to be felt without making any decisions, without drafting any letters, without standing at windows looking at the road. 3 days to just be inside the situation without trying to fix it or understand it or make it into a story with a shape she could manage. The first day she cleaned the inn from top to bottom. Not the routine cleaning, the kind she did every week on a schedule her mother had established. And she'd never changed. The real kind. Moving furniture, pulling everything out of closets, getting behind the radiators with a brush. She worked from 7 in the morning until her knees ached and her shoulders were sore and the light had gone flat and gray outside, and she ate crackers and cheese standing at the kitchen counter because she was too tired to cook, and she went to bed at 9 and actually slept. The second day she drove into town and did things she'd been putting off. She went to the bank and sat across from a woman named Linda, who had a kind face and a direct manner, and walked her through the numbers without making her feel stupid, which Claire had been afraid of. The numbers were not good, but they were not unsurvivable, which was the word Linda used, and Claire thought that unsurvivable and survivable were not as far apart as they ought to be, but that survivable was something to work with. She stopped at the hardware store and talked to Don about the gutter on the north side. Don came out the following week, he said, and she could pay him in installments if that helped. And she said it did, and thanked him and drove back to the inn with a bag of groceries and a very specific kind of tired that had nothing to do with sleep. The third day she let herself think about Ethan. She sat on the front porch in the cold March air with her coffee going cold in her hands, and she let herself look directly at it, all of it, November and February. And the March visit that had lasted less than 24 hours and ended with a check face down on a desk. She tried to be honest about her part and how it had gone. Not the punishing kind of honest, where you list your failures until you've justified any outcome as deserved. The useful kind. The kind that asks, what was true and what did you do with it and what would you do differently? She had been afraid. That was the root of most of it. Not afraid of Ethan specifically, but afraid of the complexity. The way the truth she was holding was also her sister's story, and her mother's story, and her own story, all tangled together in a way that made it impossible to hand over one strand without pulling the whole knot apart. She had told herself she was being considerate of his peace. She had partly been protecting her own. The phone call with Diana in December. That was the thing she kept coming back to. She had told Diana about the letters. She hadn't needed to. Diana hadn't asked. She'd picked up the phone when Diana called and listened to her sister's voice, strange and slightly flattened, the way Diana's voice got when she was performing a version of herself she didn't fully believe in. And at some point in the conversation, she'd said, I found letters. Letters Ethan wrote to you, to Mom's address. They were never opened. Diana had gone very quiet. Then she'd said, don't send them. It won't help him. Let it be done. And Claire had done the thing she always did in conversations with Diana, which was to not say the thing she was actually thinking, which was, you don't get to decide what helps him. You stopped having that authority when you walked away from him and his 4-year-old daughter and never looked back. She hadn't said it. She had mailed the letters anyway, 8 weeks later. But she hadn't said it. That call was something Ethan knew about now, through Marcus, stripped of context and delivered in whatever way Marcus had chosen to deliver it. And she had no idea what version Marcus had given him, or how it had landed, or what Ethan had been thinking during their conversation about trust and real things and sentences he couldn't finish yet. She went inside and wrote a letter. Not a draft, not a practice version. The real one, start to finish, without stopping to reconsider. She wrote it by hand because she thought it should be by hand, the same way his letters to Diana had been by hand. She used the good stationery she'd found in her mother's desk, cream-colored paper that was slightly yellowed at the edges from years in a drawer but was still good quality. She sat at the kitchen table and wrote without stopping, 7 pages, the kind of writing that comes out of you when you've been holding something long enough that it has found its own shape. She told him about the December phone call. She told him exactly what Diana had said and exactly what she hadn't said in response, and why. She told him she didn't know what Marcus had said or how he'd said it, but that she wanted him to have the full version because partial versions were what had gotten them here, and she was done dealing in partial versions. She told him that she had not called Diana to coordinate anything, or to protect herself, or to get ahead of a story. She had told Diana about the letters because Diana was her sister, and some habits of the heart don't end just because a relationship does, and she had thought, stupidly, that Diana might want to know, that it might mean something to her. She told him Diana's response had told her everything she needed to know about what she should do next, which was mail the letters herself regardless. Then she wrote the hard part. I know you came back in March because something in you wasn't finished. I know you sat with me in that kitchen and said careful things and were trying to figure out whether what you were feeling was real or convenient. I understand why you left. I'm not asking you to explain it or defend it. What I want to tell you is that nothing about what happened in November was strategic. I didn't keep who I was from you in order to gain something or to position myself. I did it because I was afraid. And fear is a bad reason to do most things, but it's a very human one, and I've spent enough time pretending I'm above it. I also want to tell you that whatever Diana told people about why your marriage ended, and whatever story has been living in your family and hers for years, the letters I read said something very different. You were not the person in that story. I know that doesn't undo the years you spent inside that version of it, but I thought you should hear it from someone in a position to know, even if I'm the last person you want to hear it from right now. I'm not asking you to call me. I'm not asking you to come back. I'm not asking for anything at all. I just couldn't let the things I knew stay unsaid any longer, and I think if you're honest with yourself, you already know that's true of me. That's what I am. Someone who eventually says the true thing, even when it's late. She signed it Claire and nothing else. She folded it into an envelope, sealed it, wrote his Manhattan address from memory. She had written it in the guest ledger in November, and she had not forgotten it, which was information about herself she didn't examine too closely, and drove to the post office before she could change her mind. On the way back, she stopped at the overlook above the harbor and sat in the car for a while looking at the water. The March light was thin and cold, and the harbor was the color of old pewter. A few boats were out. She could see the decommissioned lighthouse at the point, its red top visible even from this distance, the one Sophie had wanted to see because of a book about a girl detective who used birds. She thought about Sophie holding Gerald up toward the fireplace, introducing him to the heat. She drove back to the inn. April arrived and brought actual guests, 3 bookings, then a 4th, then a week in the middle of the month where every room was occupied for the first time since her mother had been alive, and Claire cooked and cleaned and managed and fell into bed each night with the particular exhaustion that comes from doing work that has a point. The travel blog feature went live on the 7th, and she got 12 inquiries in 2 days, which was more than she'd gotten in the previous 3 months combined. The writer who had stayed in April for her writing retreat wrote a short piece about the inn for a regional magazine. Claire hadn't asked her to, she'd done it because she wanted to. And that brought 3 more bookings for May. The math was still not good. It was less bad than it had been. She and Dawn fixed the north gutter on a Tuesday afternoon in early April, with Claire holding the ladder and handing up materials while Dawn worked. And when it was done, he looked at the roofline for a while and said the flashing on the east chimney was also a concern. Not urgent, but worth watching, and she said she'd watch it. And they went inside and she made coffee, and they talked about the harbor and the season and the way the town had been changing slowly. the way small coastal towns changed when they got discovered, and then had to reckon with the discovery. Your mother would be glad you kept it, Dawn said. Not sentimental about it, just a fact. I hope so, Claire said. Some days I think she'd tell me to find a life somewhere that didn't require this much weather stripping. Dawn laughed. She was practical. She was very practical. But she kept the inn 40 years. She did. He drove away, and Claire stood on the porch and thought that some people show their love through what they refuse to give up, and that her mother had been one of those people, and that maybe she was one of those people too, and that this was not always comfortable, but it was something. Joanna called on a Friday night in the middle of April and asked how things were going with the situation, which was the word they'd landed on because it was more accurate than most alternatives. Mailed a letter, Claire said, 3 weeks ago. And? Nothing. Joanna was quiet for a moment. Nothing meaning no response, or nothing meaning you mailed it to the wrong address. Nothing meaning no response. Okay. Joanna had the voice of someone composing their next sentence carefully. How are you doing with that? I'm keeping busy. Claire. I'm okay, she said. I'm actually okay. I think. She looked out the kitchen window at the April evening, the harbor going gold in the late light. I said what I needed to say. I stopped carrying things I was carrying. Whatever happens next it's not mine to determine. That's very mature of you. It's less mature than it sounds. I check the mail every day like a person who does not have that attitude at all. Joanna laughed, which was what Claire had wanted. For what it's worth, Joanna said, a man who came back to a place knowing it was complicated with his daughter because something wasn't finished. That's not a man who throws things away. He might throw this one away. He might, Joanna agreed, but I don't think so. You've never met him? No, but you've been talking about him for 6 months without knowing you were talking about him, and you've never done that before with anyone. So, Claire didn't have a response to that. She refilled her wine and changed the subject, and they talked for another hour about other things. And when she hung up, she sat in the kitchen for a while with the quiet around her and thought about what Joanna had said, and thought that it was probably true, and that true things could be comforting and terrifying in exactly equal measure. The letter from Diana came on a Wednesday in late April. Not an email, an actual letter, handwritten on Diana's distinctive stationery. Thick paper, the kind she'd always used, part of the persona she'd built for herself in the years of the good marriage. Claire recognized the handwriting before she'd even finished pulling it out of the mailbox. She stood at the end of the drive for a moment, just holding it. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table and opened it. Diana's handwriting was the same as it had always been. Large, looping, not the kind that suggested someone was deeply interested in legibility, but the kind that looked good at a distance, which had always seemed to Claire very Diana. Claire, I know you sent the letters. I know because Marcus Holloway called me 2 weeks ago and told me. He was not kind about it, but he wasn't wrong about what he said, which was that I owe you an explanation even if I'm probably too late to give you a useful one. I don't want to go through all of it. You and I have never been good at the long version of things, but there are things you should know that you won't have found in those letters because they're things Ethan didn't know. I married him because I wanted what he represented. That's the honest version. The version I've been giving people, including myself, doesn't hold up anymore, and I'm too tired to keep maintaining it. He wasn't absent. He was busy, which is different, and I used the difference to construct something I needed to construct to make leaving feel justified. I was not fair to him. I know that now. I knew it then, somewhere I didn't look. There was a moment, maybe a year into the marriage, when I could have decided to be a different kind of person. I didn't. I don't know why that is. I've spent a lot of time on that question and I don't have a good answer, which I think is just the truth about certain kinds of selfishness. It doesn't have a reason that satisfies. What I want to say to you is that you were right to send them. I told you not to because I was afraid of what it would start, and that was my fear, not wisdom. And you shouldn't have listened to me. I don't expect anything from you. I know I've used up what I had with you and with Mom, and probably with everyone who knew me before I became whoever it is I've been for the last several years. But I wanted you to know that I'm not the story I've been telling. I was someone who was afraid and wanted things, and didn't know how to be honest about either, and I hurt people, and I'm trying now to at least stop pretending that didn't happen. Take care of yourself. You were always better at this kind of life than I was. D. Claire read it twice. Then she folded it and put it on the table in front of her and looked at it. She had spent years being angry at Diana in the low-grade, pervasive way you're angry at someone you love, who has done something you can't undo. The anger had never been loud. It had just been there, underneath things, a constant, mild pressure. She'd gotten used to it the way you get used to an old injury. You stop noticing it until you move a certain way. She noticed it now. And she noticed, sitting at that table with her sister's letter in front of her, that the pressure was different. Not gone, but different. Like something that had been locked had been unlocked, and the unlocking hadn't fixed the thing, but now at least the door could open. She didn't know what she was going to do with Diana. That was a question for later, or for never, or for some version of herself that had more clarity than she had right now. But she folded the letter carefully and put it in the drawer with the check Ethan had left, and the maintenance log with E. Holloway written in small letters, and the things she was accumulating that didn't have a place yet. 2 weeks after Diana's letter, on a Thursday afternoon in early May, she was on the front porch repainting the porch railing. It had needed it since she'd done the floorboards in March, and she'd been putting off the railing because painting railings was fiddly and annoying when she heard a car. She didn't look up immediately. Guests arrived. That was the point of an inn. But then she heard the footsteps on the gravel, and something in the cadence of them was familiar, in the way that certain rhythms are familiar, not because you can name them, but because your body recognizes them before your brain catches up. And she set down her brush. Marcus Holloway looked older than he had in February. Not dramatically, just in the way that people who have been carrying something heavy look older, a quality of wear around the eyes. He was alone. She looked past him at the lot. Just his car. "He doesn't know I'm here," Marcus said. "Okay," she said. "Can I—" He looked at the door. She got up and opened it. She made coffee because it was something to do and because whatever Marcus had driven an hour and a half to say was going to need something to sit beside it. He sat at the kitchen table, the same chair he'd sat in February, and she brought the mugs over and sat across from him. He looked like a man who had prepared a speech and lost confidence in it on the drive over. "I owe you an apology," he said. She waited. "I came here in February and I offered you money to stay out of my brother's life. And then I told him about your call with Diana in a way that was—" He stopped. "I told him in a way that was designed to land badly. I chose the framing. I knew what I was doing, and I did it anyway." He looked at his coffee. "That was wrong." "It was," she said. "I've been telling myself for a long time that I look out for Ethan because no one else does it properly," he said. "That's true, as far as it goes. But somewhere along the way, looking out for him became something else. Something about controlling what happens to him so I don't have to feel the fear of watching him get hurt." He paused. "He told me that, in March, on the porch. He said it without being cruel, which is—" Marcus's mouth compressed briefly. "That's very Ethan." "Yes," Claire said. "It is. He's not speaking to me. Not completely. He calls about Sophie, about business things that require both of us. But the rest of it is." He shook his head slightly. "We've never been here before, he and I." "I'm sorry," Claire said, and meant it. Marcus looked at her like he'd expected something different from her. Defensiveness, maybe, or satisfaction, and was recalibrating. "I told him I came here in February," he said, "after he left in March. I told him all of it, including what I actually said to you and what you said back to me." "How did he take it?" "He was quiet for a very long time," Marcus said, "which with Ethan usually means he's recalibrating something significant." He paused. "He asked me why you'd turned down the money." "What did you tell him?" "I told him what you said, that you weren't going to take money from someone who wanted something from you." Marcus looked at her steadily. He was quiet for a long time after that, too. She wrapped her hands around her mug. "He read your letter," Marcus said. "The one you mailed in March. He read it the day it arrived, and I know because he called me that night and was not angry, something past anger, the kind of quiet that means something has broken through." He paused. "He didn't tell me what it said. He told me to call you and apologize, which I've been—" He looked at the window. "I've been working up to it for 5 weeks, which is longer than it should have taken." "Ethan told you to apologize to me?" He said, his exact words were, She told the truth without being asked to and without getting anything for it, and you owe her for what you did. The kitchen was very quiet. She didn't have anything to say to that. She sat with it, feeling the weight of it, the particular quality of being seen accurately by someone you weren't sure could still see you clearly. I also want to tell you something, Marcus said, that I haven't told Ethan yet, because I need to tell someone and I think you're the right person, even though that's a strange thing to say. Okay. I called Diana, he said. After everything, I wanted to, I don't know what I wanted. Answers, maybe. Someone to be angry at who wasn't my brother or you. He turned his mug. She told me what she told you, about the marriage, about why it ended, the real version. He paused. She didn't apologize to me. I didn't expect her to, but she said something that I keep thinking about. What? She said, Ethan deserves someone honest. I wasn't that. I hope he finds it. Marcus looked at Claire. She said it like she meant it. I don't know if she did, but she said it like she meant it. Claire thought about Diana's letter, about you were always better at this kind of life than I was, about the way her sister had always been somewhat foreign to her, this woman who had grown up in the same house and gone such a different direction, and the sadness of that. Not the angry version of the sadness, the actual one underneath it, the grief of a sister who had loved someone she couldn't reach. She meant it, Claire said quietly. Marcus nodded. He finished his coffee. He set the mug down with the careful deliberateness of someone who has said what they came to say and is now determining how to leave. I don't know what's going to happen, he said. With Ethan. With you. I don't know what he's going to decide. He looked at her. But I wanted you to know that whatever it is, I'm not going to be in the way of it this time. Okay, she said. He stopped. Started again. I'm not good at this. Staying out of things. I know, she said. I could tell that in February. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to his face, but it came close. He's lucky you're patient, he said. I'm not particularly patient, Claire said. I just know when to wait. He stood up and buttoned his coat, and she walked him to the door. On the porch, he paused and looked out at the harbor, at the late afternoon light coming across the water in long, flat lines, the way May light did on this coast. It's a good place, he said. I know. I can see why he keeps coming back to it. She didn't say anything to that, but she felt it. The way you feel something when someone names it plainly and you realize you've been holding your breath, waiting for someone to. He drove away. She stood on the freshly painted porch and looked at the harbor. Hotte. 3 days later, on a Sunday morning when the inn was empty between bookings, she was in the dining room replacing the bulbs in the light fixture over the center table, standing on a chair, which was slightly precarious and which she would have accepted help with if help had been available, when she heard the bell over the front door. She didn't fall off the chair. She was quite proud of that. She climbed down, set the burned-out bulbs on the table, and walked into the lobby. He was standing at the front desk. Dark coat. No umbrella. Hair slightly damp from the morning, which was cool and overcast the way May mornings on the coast often were. The sky not committing to rain, but not ruling it out either. He had a small bag over his shoulder. He looked at her. She looked at him. He looked like a man who had driven a long way thinking about what he was going to say and had arrived at the realization that none of it was right, which was, she thought, maybe the most honest place to arrive. Sophie's with my parents, he said. This week. Okay, she said. I wanted to. He stopped, looked at the desk, at the guest ledger still sitting in the same place. I've been thinking about what you wrote. In the letter. She waited. You said you're someone who eventually says the true thing, even when it's late. He looked up. I've been thinking about that. Whether that's true. Whether it's true about me? Whether I believe it. He held her gaze. I think I do. I think that's actually what you are. And I think... He set his bag down. I think the reason it's hard for me to trust that is completely my problem and not yours. It's not nothing that I kept things from you. No, he agreed. But I've been sitting with it, and when I try to be honest about it, I keep coming back to the same thing, which is that you had 7 letters proving your own sister had lied about her marriage, and you mailed them to me anyway. And then you wrote me a letter telling me about the phone call with Diana in December. When you didn't have to. When I'd already gone and you had no reason to think I'd come back. He paused. That's not manipulation. That's someone telling the truth after they were scared and then stopped being scared. Her throat was doing something inconvenient. She focused on keeping her face steady. I was scared, she said. I know. He was quiet for a moment. I've been scared for 3 years. I've been running a company and raising a daughter and being as functional as I could manage. And the whole time there was this, he looked for the word, this wall between me and anything that felt real, because real things can fall apart, and I'd had enough of that. That makes sense. It makes sense, and it's a miserable way to live, he said flatly. Sophie knows. Not in the way she'd articulate it, she's 6, but she knows that her dad is present but protected. She told me last month that I seemed sad sometimes, even when I was smiling, and I didn't know how to respond to that. And she said, it's okay, Gerald gets sad too sometimes, and went back to her book. He looked at Claire. I'm being out-emotional intelligenced by a stuffed penguin. A laugh came out of her before she could stop it, real and sudden, and something in his face cracked open slightly at the sound of it. I'm not here to ask you to fix anything, he said. I know that's not how it works. He picked up his bag. I'd like a room, if you have one. Room 4 is free, she said. Same as before. Same as before. He nodded. He reached into his coat and came out with his wallet, but she shook her head. We can deal with that later, she said. He put the wallet back. She reached under the desk for the guest ledger and opened it to the current page and wrote his name in the line. Same handwriting as November. Same ledger. The page was different. The dates were different. Everything that had happened in between was different, but the ledger was the same and the handwriting was the same. And the key for room 4 was on the same hook it had always been. She handed it to him. Their fingers didn't quite touch. Close enough that the air between them was charged with the awareness of not touching, which is its own very specific thing. There are extra blankets in the closet, she said. I remember. Breakfast is at 8. I remember that too. He went upstairs. She stood at the desk for a moment, looking at his name in the ledger. Then she went back to the dining room and climbed back onto the chair and finished replacing the light bulbs, because the light bulbs needed doing and someone had to do them. And she was a person who finished things she'd started. The new bulb came on warm and steady when she flipped the switch. She stood on the chair, looking up at it for a second. Then she climbed down and went to make dinner, and this time she cooked for 2. She made pasta again. Not because it was the only thing she knew how to make. She had spent the better part of 30 years learning to cook in this kitchen and could manage considerably more than pasta, but because pasta was the meal she'd been making the night he'd sat at this table in November and kept her company while the sauce went for 3 hours, and something in her had decided, without consulting the rational part of her brain, that it was the right place to start again. She didn't make a production of it. She didn't light candles or set the dining room table with the good dishes. She cooked in the kitchen and set 2 places at the kitchen table, which was where they'd always ended up anyway, both of them gravitating toward the room that was actually warm, the room that smelled like food and had the copper pots on the wall and the slightly imperfect seal on the window that let in just enough harbor air to remind you where you were. He came down at 6:30 without being asked, which meant he'd smelled the onions and followed them, which was a very human thing and which made her feel, briefly, like something was going to be okay. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the kitchen, at the pot on the stove, at the 2 places set at the table, at the wine she'd opened and left breathing on the counter. You didn't have to do this, he said. I know, she said. Sit down. He sat. She brought the food over and they ate, and for the first 10 minutes they didn't say anything of consequence. She asked about the drive. He said it had been fine. She mentioned that the north gutter had finally been repaired. He looked up at the ceiling in the automatic way of someone assessing a building and said the trim above the window on the east wall might need attention before winter, and she said she knew she'd been watching it. It was the most ordinary conversation. It was also somehow the best conversation she'd had in weeks. I owe you something, he said after a while. You don't owe me anything. I left in March without talking to you, he said. I just left. There was a check on the desk and I walked out, and that was... He put his fork down. That was a bad thing to do. I was angry and I took the easy exit, and I'm not proud of it. You were processing something, she said. That's allowed. You still deserve better than a check and an empty parking lot. She looked at him across the kitchen table, at the face she'd spent 5 months thinking about in various configurations of hope and frustration, and something she still wasn't quite calling by its right name. "Okay," she said. "Thank you for saying that." "I mean it." "I know you do. That's why I said thank you." He picked his fork back up. Something in him had eased the way it used to ease in November after the first hour of an evening together, when he stopped performing composure and just sat in a room like a person. "Marcus came to see me," she said. "I know. He told me." "He apologized." "He told me that too." He turned his wine glass. "How was it?" "Honest," she said. "He's not someone who does things halfway. Even apologies." "No," Ethan agreed. "He's not." A pause. It's getting better. Between us. It's slow and it's still a little strange, but it's getting better." "Good." "He called it an adjustment period," Ethan said, which is his way of describing the process of learning to stop trying to run someone else's life. It's technically accurate and completely undersells how uncomfortable it is. Sounds about right. He almost smiled. She was learning the geography of his almost smiles, which ones were close and which ones needed something more before they arrived. "Diana wrote to me," she said. He went still. "In April. A letter." She set her fork down, giving the subject the weight it deserved. "She told me the real version of what happened in the marriage, not the version she'd been giving people." She paused. "She said she wasn't the person in the story she'd been telling, that she'd been afraid and wanted things and didn't know how to be honest about either." Ethan was quiet for a long time. "Did it help?" he asked finally. "Getting that?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "It's complicated having a sister. Even when the sister is what she is, there's a grief in it that doesn't have a clean place to land." She looked at the table. "But it helped with something. The pressure of carrying it eased a little, which is maybe enough for now." He nodded slowly. "She sent me one too," he said. Claire looked up. 2 weeks ago. Shorter than whatever she wrote you, I'm guessing. 3 paragraphs. He turned his wine glass again. "She apologized. Said she'd rewritten her own history and understood if I never wanted to hear from her again." He was quiet. "She asked about Sophie, said she thought about her sometimes." "What did you do with it?" "Read it 4 times and put it away." He looked at her. "I don't know if I'll respond. I haven't decided. There's no—" He paused, searching for the right word. "There's no urgency to it, strangely. It doesn't feel like something that requires immediate resolution. It's just a letter. It'll sit somewhere and I'll know what to do with it when I know." That was, Claire thought, possibly the most emotionally mature thing she'd heard anyone say about anything in recent memory, and she told him so. He looked slightly embarrassed. "I've had a good therapist for 2 years," he said. "She deserves most of the credit." That's also a very emotionally mature thing to say. "Stop," he said, but the almost smile arrived all the way this time, full and unguarded, and she felt it in the center of her chest like something warm. They did the dishes together, which was not something she normally allowed. Guests were guests. The kitchen was her domain. But it happened naturally, him clearing the table and her at the sink, and it didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like 2 people in a kitchen at the end of a meal, which was a simple thing that turned out to have a lot of weight in it. After, they went to the fireplace. She'd built the fire up while he was upstairs earlier, so by now it was good and settled, throwing steady heat. The harbor outside had gone completely dark, just the occasional light of a boat moving at distance. The inn was quiet in the way it got when it was empty except for the right people. He sat in his chair, the one he'd sat in November, which she had stopped thinking of as a guest chair and started thinking of as his chair, which was information about herself she acknowledged without apologizing for. She sat in hers. He had the letters. She hadn't expected that. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and came out with an envelope she recognized. The cream-colored stationery, slightly yellowed at the edges, and set it on the arm of his chair. "I brought your letter back," he said. "Not to return it. Just—" He looked at it. "I've been carrying it for 2 months. I wanted to show you something." He opened it and turned to the last page. She could see her own handwriting from across the small space between their chairs. He pointed to a line near the bottom. "You said you're someone who eventually says the true thing, even when it's late," he said. "I've been thinking about that sentence more than any other sentence in 2 months." What about it? That eventually. He looked up. The word you chose. Not always. Not reliably. Eventually. He paused. Most people would have edited that out, made themselves sound more dependable. You left the thing in that was honest about your limitation. She hadn't thought about it in those terms. She'd written what was true, and this was, apparently, what was true. I know I'm not consistent about it, she said. I knew it when I wrote it. That's exactly the thing, he said. That's the thing I kept coming back to. He folded the letter and put it back in his pocket, and she understood that he was keeping it, that he hadn't brought it back to return it, but to show her that he still had it, which was its own kind of statement. I've been lied to by people who were very consistent, he said, very smooth about it. Diana was never uncertain. She told her stories the same way every time because she'd polished them. She'd had the doubt out. There were no rough edges where she'd been honest about a limitation. Claire said nothing. She waited. You're full of rough edges, he said. Not unkindly. The opposite of unkindly. That's one way to put it. It's the right way, he said. You fixed a pipe with duct tape for 3 weeks before you let me help. You said your end felt like a rock tied to your ankle, and then immediately said that came out wrong. You told me you were nervous about the gutter, and it came out as advice. He looked at her steadily. You're a person who doesn't entirely have it together, who is trying anyway, and who tells the truth about the trying. She felt the heat of the fire on her face and thought about how to receive something said that directly. That's a very specific thing to notice, she said. I've had 2 months and a lot of quiet evenings to notice it, he said. Sophie goes to bed at 8:30. The apartment is very quiet after 8:30. That sounds lonely. It is. He said it simply, without drama. It's been lonely for a long time, and I got used to it, which is one of those adaptations that looks like strength but is actually just accommodation, she said. Yes. He looked at the fire. Accommodation. They sat with that for a while. The fire settled. Outside, the harbor breathed its low, patient sounds. I don't know how to do this, he said to the fire, and she understood that this was not a small word in that sentence. I don't either, she said. I've never done something like this. Whatever this is. Whatever this is, she agreed. He turned to look at her. Is that okay? Not knowing? She thought about the question honestly, about the version of herself that would have said yes because it was the thing that kept the conversation moving forward, about the version that might have said it to be agreeable, to give him what he seemed to need, to smooth the road. She said, I'm more comfortable not knowing than I used to be. The inn taught me that, I think. You can't run a place like this if you need certainty about how it's going to go. The weather changes, the roof leaks, the guests arrive in November storms and stay longer than planned. She paused. So yes, it's okay. I'd rather be here, not knowing, than anywhere else. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached over and turned his wine glass on the arm of his chair, a gesture she recognized. He did it when he was thinking through something with some finality. I want to tell you something, he said. Something I was going to say in March, and then didn't. Okay. The sentence I said I wasn't going to finish. He looked at her directly. When I was sitting by the cold fireplace, and I said I kept trying to remember what it felt like in November, and I was about to say something about what it felt like, and I stopped. He paused. I stopped because I was still angry, and I thought if I said it, it would feel like a concession, like I was giving up the ground I was standing on. What was the sentence? He was quiet for a moment, then, that I think I've been in love with you since somewhere around the 3rd evening in November, and I've been trying to talk myself out of it ever since because it was inconvenient and complicated, and the circumstances were, objectively, a mess. The fire made a small sound. Claire sat very still. The talking yourself out of it, she said carefully. Did it work? No, he said. Not even a little. She let out a breath she'd apparently been holding without knowing it. I'm not saying that to pressure you, he said quickly. I'm not saying it to, Ethan, make it into something you have to respond to right now. I know it's Ethan. She said his name more firmly, and he stopped. I'm not pressured. She searched for the word and found the honest one. Relieved. I'm relieved. Because I've been in the same place since about the 3rd evening, and I've also been trying to talk myself out of it, and I also failed completely. He stared at her, then he laughed. The real laugh, The sudden unguarded one she'd heard in November when he was on the floor fixing the pipe, and she'd said something dry about boardrooms. It filled the small room the way a real laugh does, and the sound of it was the best thing she'd heard in months. "We're both idiots," he said. "Reasonably intelligent people who made things very complicated," she said. "Idiots," he said again, still with the tail end of the laugh in his voice. She was smiling so wide her face hurt slightly, which was undignified, and she didn't care. They talked until 1 in the morning, not about the big things, not about what happened next or how it worked logistically, or what it meant for Sophie or any of the structural questions that would eventually need answering. There was time for that. The big things deserve more than one night, and they both seemed to understand that without saying so. They talked about small things, about Sophie's ongoing campaign for a dog, which had now incorporated a research dossier she'd assembled from library books listing the 5 most suitable breeds for a family with 1 child and 1 very busy dad. About the inn and what Claire had been doing to it since April, the gutter and the window and the travel blog feature, and the April week with every room full. He asked questions about the bookings like someone who was genuinely interested in the mechanics, and she answered with the kind of detail she usually kept to herself because most people didn't actually want it, and he did. He actually wanted it. She told him about Joanna's standing offer to come to Portland, which she'd been turning down for 18 months. "Are you still turning it down?" he asked. "Every time," she said, with more confidence than I had before. "Good," he said. "Just that." She told him about Dawn and the gutter and the installment payment plan, and he listened and then said carefully, "I want to help with the inn, not financially or not as an investment. I just want to—" He stopped. "I'm good with my hands. I grew up on job sites, and the inn needs work, and I have the knowledge to do some of it, and I'd like to do it. You can't just come up on weekends and fix things." "Why not?" "Because that's—" She tried to find why not and ran into the fact that she didn't have a strong argument. "Because it's a lot of driving." "I've noticed I don't mind the drive," he said, with the tone of someone reporting a finding. She looked at him. "You're serious?" "I'm extremely serious." "You want to spend your weekends fixing my roof?" "Parts of it, yes. Not the whole roof, that's a professional job. The trim, the window, the things that are within scope." He looked at her steadily. "I spent 20 minutes fixing a pipe in November, and it was the best 20 minutes I'd had in a year. I want more of that." "You want more pipe fixing?" "I want more of what that felt like," he said, precise and unembarrassed about the precision. "Which was useful, concrete. Something I did with my hands that produced a result I could see." He paused. "I spend most of my life moving abstractions around. Money, projections, proposals. I miss things that are just things." She understood that. More than he probably knew. "Okay," she said. "Okay? Come fix things," she said. "Bring Sophie when she wants to come. There are birds on the dock she hasn't met yet." Something in his face did what it did when he was feeling something he hadn't expected to feel. A brief openness, quickly steadied but not hidden. "I'll tell her about the birds," he said. "She'll have strong opinions." "She always has strong opinions," Claire said. "She really does," he agreed with the helpless pride of someone who had stopped being able to take credit for that. He left Tuesday morning, not in the way he'd left in March, not with a check face down on the desk and a parking lot that felt like a door closing. He came downstairs with his bag at 7:30, and she had coffee and toast ready because she'd been up since 6 and needed something to do, and they sat at the kitchen table for 45 minutes before he had to go, not saying anything urgent, just being in the same room in the morning, which was its own thing. At the door he picked up his bag and then put it back down. "Can I call you?" he asked. "Not about the inn, just—" "Yes," she said. "Tonight, probably. After Sophie's in bed." "That's fine." He picked up his bag again. At the door he paused, and she thought he was going to say something else, but instead he looked at her for a moment with that clear, direct look she knew now had nothing managed in it, and then he nodded once and went. She watched the car out of the lot from the window. Then she turned around and looked at the lobby. The armchairs, the fireplace, the desk with the ledger open to the page with his name on it, the copper pots just visible through the kitchen doorway. She went and made herself a second cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table alone, and she thought that this was what beginning felt like. Not arrival, not resolution, just beginning. The specific quality of something that has stopped being uncertain and started being real, which was its own kind of terrifying and its own kind of good. He called at 9:15, 15 minutes after Sophie's 8:30 bedtime, which meant she'd negotiated him down by 15 minutes, which tracked. "She wants to know about the birds," he said when Claire picked up. "I mentioned the doc, and she's been asking follow-up questions for 45 minutes." "What kind of questions?" "Do they have names? Are they friendly? Can they be trained? Whether Gerald would be welcome." A pause. "I told her Gerald would probably be welcome." "Gerald is welcome," Claire confirmed. "I told her we'd come back in a few weeks. She said she needs that in writing." "She's 6. She's very legally minded for 6, he said, and she could hear the smile in it. "I think she gets it from my brother. Considering everything, that's a complicated thing to inherit." "It really is." A beat of quiet, the comfortable kind. The kind that had started in November and been interrupted and was finding its way back. "How's the inn?" "Quiet," she said. "Good quiet." "Good." She was sitting in the armchair by the fireplace, the fire banked low, the front lamp on in the window the way it always was. The harbor outside was making its sounds. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah." "Thank you for coming back." A pause. "Thank you for keeping the lamp on," he said. The months that followed were not a straight line. She wanted to say that, to be honest about the shape of it, because the shape of it mattered. Things that are real don't go in straight lines. They go in the crooked path of two people with separate histories and separate fears and separate bad habits, learning to make room for each other without either of them disappearing in the process. Ethan came up the first weekend of June with a truck and tools and spent 2 days on the trim above the east window. He was methodical and somewhat perfectionist about it, which surprised her and then didn't, because he was methodical and somewhat perfectionist about everything. He redid a section she thought was fine because there was a gap he said would cause problems in winter. And she told him she had been watching that trim for 2 years, and he said watching it hadn't actually done anything about the gap. And she said that was a fair point, and he said thank you. And they didn't argue about it, but they were both slightly annoyed with each other for about an hour, which was very normal and which felt strangely like progress. Sophie came the second weekend, with Gerald in the folder of investigation materials and an annotated list of questions about the birds she'd prepared in the intervening weeks. The birds, as it turned out, did not respond well to the systematic inquiry she'd planned. A large gray herring gull stole her cracker on the first afternoon, and she was genuinely outraged about it, which meant the gull became the primary subject of the investigation rather than a friendly contact, which meant the folder's organizational structure had to be substantially revised. "He's a criminal," Sophie said at dinner, about the gull. "They all are, a little," Claire said. "It's just their nature." Sophie considered this. "Gerald says even criminals have reasons," she said. "Gerald is wise." "He reads a lot," Sophie confirmed. Ethan was watching his daughter across the table with the expression Claire had come to know well, the one that was helpless love and helpless pride, and a little bit of fear about how much of himself he saw in her, all at once. He caught Claire watching him watch Sophie, and for a second they just looked at each other, and it was the kind of look that didn't need anything added to it. Sophie noticed. She looked from her father to Claire and back with the focused attention of someone collecting evidence. "Are you two in love?" she asked. Ethan choked on his water. Claire pressed her lips together very firmly. "Why do you ask?" Ethan said when he'd recovered. "Because you make the same face at each other that people make in books," Sophie said with complete equanimity, right before they say it. She speared a piece of pasta. "I'm not upset about it. I just want to know so I can update my files." There was a silence. "Your files," Ethan said carefully. "About the trip," Sophie said. "I'm keeping records." "Of course you are," Ethan said. He looked at Claire. She looked at him. "Yes," Ethan said to his daughter. "I think that's fair to say." Sophie nodded, as though this confirmed a hypothesis she had been developing for some time. "Okay," she said. Gerald said probably. After Sophie was in bed that night, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with the slightly stunned look of a man who had just been logically outmaneuvered by a first grader. "She keeps files," he said. "I know." "About people?" "I know." She has a file about me, he said, on a trip I took with her. That does seem like something that should concern you. She probably has notes. He put his face in his hands briefly. She absolutely has notes. Claire laughed, and he looked up at the sound of it, and the stunned expression softened into something warmer, and he said, I like that sound. What sound? You laughing. In this kitchen. He looked at the copper pots, the window with its imperfect seal, the stove where 3-hour sauces happened. It sounds right in here. She thought about all the meals cooked alone in this kitchen, all the dinners for one, all the February nights and the January mornings and the months of white-knuckling something that felt like her last connection to the person who had taught her what home meant. It feels right, she said. Marcus came in July. He called ahead this time, so called Ethan first, actually, to ask if it was all right, which was the kind of small recalibration that suggested real change rather than performed change. Ethan told him it was his choice and Claire's, and that he should call her himself. He called her on a Thursday. I'd like to come up, he said. Not to the inn, necessarily. I thought I could take you and Ethan to dinner, in town. If that's... He paused. If that's something you'd want. That's something I'd want, she said. They went to the one good restaurant in town, which was small and loud and run by a woman named Carol who had been feeding the local population since the early 90s and had no patience for fuss. Marcus looked slightly out of place in the bright, busy room and then ordered a beer instead of wine, which made him look considerably less out of place. And by the second round of drinks, he was listening to Claire's description of Sophie's ongoing gull investigation with what appeared to be genuine entertainment. She has a folder, Ethan said. She showed me, Marcus said. She showed it to me on the drive up last month. Very thorough, cross-referenced. She's 6, Claire said. She's terrifying, Marcus said with real admiration, in the best possible way. It was not a perfect dinner. There were moments of careful navigation, subjects approached with some extra deliberateness, pauses where people were choosing words, the residual awkwardness of people who had hurt each other trying to sit at the same table and be normal. Marcus and Claire had a moment in the middle of the entree where they were both reaching for the bread at the same time, and it turned into a slightly over-polite exchange that went on 2 or 3 seconds longer than it needed to, which Ethan watched with the expression of a man who was going to have something to say about it later. He did, on the drive back. You two are going to be fine, he said from the driver's seat, but you're both going to have to stop being so careful with each other. I'm being perfectly natural, Marcus said from the back seat. You offered to get her coat, Ethan said. She's been inside the whole meal. It was a courtesy. It was a negotiation tactic disguised as a courtesy. Claire turned around to look at Marcus. Marcus looked at her. He's right, she said. I know, Marcus said with the resignation of someone who'd been told a true thing. I know he's right. I know you were trying to protect him, she said. That's not lost on me. Even the way you did it. Even the money, which was wrong, it came from something real. Marcus was quiet. I'm not going to pretend the whole thing didn't happen, she said, but I'm also not going to hold it over you indefinitely. That's a waste of everyone's time, including mine. He looked at her for a moment, and something in him, the tightly managed surface of him, settled slightly. I don't know how you're that practical about things, he said. The inn, she said simply. You can't have feelings about everything. You pick what deserves them. Ethan, from the front, said nothing, but she saw his hand on the steering wheel and the way it relaxed. The bank situation resolved in August. Not dramatically. Nothing about it was dramatic, which was almost a relief. The travel blog feature had kept producing bookings through the summer, and the regional magazine piece had done the same. And a couple who had stayed in July went home and told 4 other couples, which was how word of mouth worked at this scale, slow and personal and more durable than advertising. She made enough in the summer to get ahead of the mortgage for the first time in 18 months, and to put a small amount aside for the chimney flashing Dawn had flagged in April. She called Linda at the bank in late August, and Linda said the word sustainable, which was a different word than unsurvivable and considerably better. She called Joanna that evening. The math is working, she said. The math is working, Joanna repeated with the tone of someone who had expected this to happen and was glad to have it confirmed. And the other thing? The other thing is also working, Claire said. Joanna made a sound of complete satisfaction. I've been waiting since February for you to say that. You've been waiting since November, Claire said. You just didn't know that's what you were waiting for. I knew, Joanna said. You're my best friend. I knew in November. You said nothing. You had to figure it out yourself, Joanna said. That's how it works with people like you. If someone tells you, you argue. If you figure it out yourself, you do something about it. That was accurate enough that Claire didn't bother disputing it. September brought the light that the coast did in September, low and golden and slightly elegiac, the way it got when the season was changing and the long summer was releasing its hold on things. The tourists thinned out, the town went quieter, the mornings got sharp again. Sophie started second grade and sent Claire a drawing of the harbor in the mail, with the gull in it, depicted in red crayon with a large X over it, labeled criminal, which made Claire put it on the refrigerator immediately. Ethan came up the third weekend of September, and they walked the harbor road in the evening, which they'd never done before. It had always been inside the inn, the warmth of it, the fire and the kitchen and the rooms. The outside was new territory. It was cold enough for jackets. The harbor smelled like the turning season. They walked without talking much, which was fine, which had been fine between them for a long time now. At the turn in the road where you could see the lighthouse from the water, he stopped. She stopped beside him. The lighthouse stood at the point, its red top exactly as she described it to Sophie months ago, the white tower going gray in the evening light, the seabirds circling its gallery in the unhurried way they'd been circling it for decades, indifferent to decommissioning, indifferent to history, just living in the structure that had become their own. Sophie wants to come back for her birthday, he said. March. The birthday she told her teacher she wanted to spend at a lighthouse. I remember, Claire said. She's been planning it since July. He looked at the lighthouse. She has a folder. Of course she does. I told her we'd ask you. He glanced over. We'd ask you. The we of that was not accidental, and they both knew it. Tell her yes, Claire said. He nodded, looked back at the lighthouse. The birds circled. The harbor moved in its slow, patient way, the same way it had moved before either of them existed and would move long after, indifferent to the small human dramas played out on its shore, which was not a bleak thought, but actually a steadying one. The reminder that the world is large and old and will keep going, and that what you do inside it matters precisely because it is small and brief and yours. I've been thinking about something, he said. What? The weekends here. He turned toward her. They're not enough. She looked at him. I'm not saying... He paused, finding the right words, not rushing them. I'm not making a proposal or issuing an ultimatum. I'm just telling you what's true, which is that I drive back Sunday nights and the apartment is very quiet, and Sophie asks when we're going back and I don't have a good answer for her. He met her eyes. I want a better answer for her. And for myself. What would a better answer look like? She asked carefully, because this mattered and she wanted to get it right. I don't know the exact shape yet, he said, but something that puts us in the same place more than 2 weekends a month. He paused. I can work remotely. I've been doing it from here on Sundays already. The company doesn't fall apart if I'm not in Manhattan every day. Sophie's in school in the city. Until June, he said. And then it's summer. And then it's fall again, and she needs to be in school somewhere. Yes, he said. She does. He held her gaze. Is this a conversation we can have? She thought about it. Really thought about it the way it deserved. Not the reflexive protection of her independence. Not the old fear that wanting something made it easier to lose, but the actual honest question of what she wanted and what she was capable of. Yes, she said. It's a conversation we can have. He exhaled. She hadn't known until he exhaled that he'd been holding his breath. It doesn't have to be figured out tonight, she said. I know. But I'm not opposed to it, she said. The direction of it, the general direction. He looked at her with something that was past the almost smiles. Something complete and unqualified. The face of a person who has arrived somewhere they weren't sure they'd get to. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. They stood at the curve in the harbor road with the lighthouse at the point, and the birds circling, and the cold September evening settling around them. And it was not perfect, and it was not finished, and there were 100 practical things still unresolved, but underneath all of that something had set. The way concrete sets. Not rigid, because nothing real is rigid, but solid, foundational. She had learned in the years of running this inn alone that you couldn't wait for certainty before you committed to something. The roof was always going to need work. The weather was always going to change. The math was never going to be completely clean. You just had to decide that the thing was worth the trouble and then be in it, present and awake, and willing to keep fixing what broke. He had learned, in the years of holding everything together by himself, that control wasn't the same as safety, that keeping people at arm's length didn't protect you from loss. It just made the loss quieter, which was not the same as making it smaller. That a 6-year-old with a stuffed penguin and a folder of investigation materials understood something he'd spent 3 years forgetting, which was that the people worth trusting were the ones who showed you their rough edges. Neither of them said any of that on the harbor road. They didn't need to. Some things, by the time you've lived them, don't need to be spoken. They walked back to the inn. She unlocked the front door and pushed it open, and the warmth came out to meet them. The smell of the place, old wood and the faint copper of the pots and the salt that never quite left the walls. The smell she had grown up with and fought for and kept lit against the dark, in the way her mother had kept lit against the dark, with nothing more and nothing less than a lamp in the front window and a door that opened when someone needed it to. She turned on the lights. He came in behind her and she heard him set his keys on the front desk, the small familiar sound of someone who knew where things went. The fire needed to be built up. There was bread to make for morning. The east window trim that Ethan had repaired in June was holding fine, but she'd check it again before the weather turned, because that was what you did with things you'd worked on. You checked them, not because you didn't trust the repair, but because attention was part of how you kept things. Outside, the harbor moved. The lamp in the front window was on, the way it always was, burning against the dark road for anyone who might be driving past in a storm, looking for a light. It had worked once. She suspected it would work again.